22 souls vanished behind locked doors while their guardians smiled. The most prolific serial killer you've never heard of walked free for years because nobody checks the good ones. Welcome to True Crime Headquarters, where every story runs darker than the last, and the truth is always colder than fiction. I'm truly glad you're here. Whether you're watching from New York, South Africa, Canada, the Philippines, the UK, Greece, Sweden, New Zealand, or any of the countless places I can't name one by one, know this: I see you, I appreciate you, and you're part of this growing family. These stories are crafted to reach those who crave truth in the quiet hours. People who unwind, think, and fall asleep with mystery lingering in their minds. But when you only watch without subscribing, liking, or commenting, these stories don't travel far. They stay hidden when they should be heard. It costs nothing to hit subscribe, drop a like, or leave a thought below. But that small action keeps this channel alive and lets me keep sharing the dark, the true, and the untold. So, if these stories speak to you, please take a moment. It means everything, and it helps keep the truth alive. So, have you subscribed yet? I'm waiting. Done? Great. Thank you. I want you to know that every click and comment counts, and you are very important and highly welcomed heir. This is the story of the angel of death who wore a nurse's uniform. We're diving into the nightmare of Arnfinn Neset, a man who transformed nursing homes into hunting grounds. This isn't about a monster who hid in shadows. This is about a killer who wore respectability like armor, who wielded mercy as a murder weapon, and who turned society's most vulnerable into prey while collecting their trust like trophies. The death toll? At least 22 confirmed. The truth? Probably far worse. And the most terrifying part? He was supposed to be their protector. I know you love falling asleep to these stories, and tonight you're in for something truly chilling. We'll be exploring 4 haunting true crime cases, each one darker than the last. So, get cozy, unwind, and let the day melt away. But before you drift off, please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and comment, and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin. Orkdal Valley, Norway, a place where fog clings to fjords like forgotten secrets, where winter nights stretch endlessly, and where the elderly came to live out their final days in peace. The year was 1977, and the Orkdal Valley Nursing Home stood as a beacon of modern care, a facility with an impeccable reputation, led by a manager whose name was spoken with reverence throughout the community. Arnfinn Neset wasn't just good at his job, he was exceptional. Patients loved him, families trusted him, staff admired his dedication, his gentle manner, his tireless work ethic. He was the kind of man who stayed late, who remembered birthdays, who held hands during difficult moments. But beneath that carefully constructed facade of compassion lived something else entirely. Neset had entered the healthcare profession in the 1960s, climbing steadily through Norway's social care system. His credentials were solid. His references glowed. He'd worked in psychiatric facilities, gained experience in nursing care, and eventually landed the prestigious position of nursing home manager. On paper, he was perfect. In practice, he was calculating every angle, studying every weakness in the system, learning exactly how much death could occur before anyone started asking uncomfortable questions. The nursing home itself was designed with efficiency in mind. Long corridors painted in muted colors, small rooms where elderly residents spent their twilight years, a medication room that only authorized staff could access. And Neset had access to everything. As manager, he controlled inventory, supervised care, signed off on death certificates, and maintained relationships with local doctors who trusted his professional judgment implicitly. He'd built himself a kingdom where his word was law, where his authority went unquestioned, and where death was simply an expected part of the landscape. His victims shared common characteristics that made them perfect targets. They were old, often in their 70s and 80s. Many suffered from dementia or other cognitive impairments. Some had few visitors or family members who lived far away. They were society's invisible population, people who existed in that liminal space between life and death, where their passing would be sad but not shocking, mourned but not investigated. Neset understood this with predatory clarity. The method he chose was diabolically clever. Curacet, known generically as succinylmethonium chloride, was a muscle relaxant used in medical procedures to paralyze patients temporarily during intubation or surgery. In controlled hospital settings with proper ventilation equipment, it was a useful tool. In a nursing home, administered secretly to an elderly patient lying alone in their bed, it became an invisible executioner. When injected, Curacet works quickly and horrifically. The victim remains fully conscious as their muscles begin to fail. First, the limbs become heavy, unresponsive. Then the respiratory muscles seize. The diaphragm stops working. They cannot breathe, cannot move, cannot scream for help. They lie there, eyes wide with terror, suffocating while their mind remains agonizingly aware of what's happening. Death comes through asphyxiation, typically within minutes, but those minutes must feel like hours as darkness closes in. The genius of Neset's weapon was its detection profile, or rather, its lack thereof. Succinylmethonium chloride breaks down rapidly in the human body into compounds that occur naturally after death. Standard autopsies wouldn't detect it. The symptoms mimicked natural causes: heart failure, respiratory collapse, conditions common in elderly patients. Unless someone specifically looked for it with sophisticated toxicology testing, and unless they tested quickly after death, it would vanish like smoke. Neset's first confirmed kill occurred in 1977, though investigators would later suspect he'd been perfecting his technique for years before that. The victim was an elderly woman under his care, someone who trusted him completely. He entered her room during night rounds when the hallways were quiet and the night staff was occupied elsewhere. He spoke to her softly, perhaps offered some comfort, then administered the injection. Maybe she didn't even feel the needle prick. Then he watched. Did he feel anything in those moments? Remorse? Excitement? Power? Investigators who later interviewed him reported that Neset displayed almost no emotion when discussing the murders. He described them clinically matter-of-factly, as if recounting mundane administrative tasks rather than the calculated extinction of human lives. After the first death, he must have waited nervously to see if anyone suspected foul play. But the system functioned exactly as he'd predicted. The death was recorded as natural causes. The family grieved. The body was prepared for burial. No toxicology screen was ordered because there was no reason to suspect poisoning. Neset had proven the concept, and now he knew he could continue. The kills came sporadically at first, spaced months apart. But as his confidence grew, the frequency increased. One death became 2. 2 became 5. 5 became 10. The nursing home's mortality rate began climbing, but this happened so gradually that it didn't trigger immediate alarm. Elderly people died in nursing homes. This was expected, unremarkable. Neset was careful never to create a sudden spike that might draw scrutiny. He was patient, methodical, playing a long game that required discipline and planning. Staff members noticed small oddities but dismissed them. Medication inventory sometimes didn't quite match up. Neset would occasionally send staff on errands that kept them away from certain hallways during specific time windows. Patients who'd been stable would suddenly deteriorate overnight. But these were small anomalies in a busy facility, easily rationalized away. Neset had cultivated such goodwill and trust that suspicion didn't naturally gravitate toward him. He was the boss, the authority figure, the person who supposedly kept everything running smoothly. He maintained his mask perfectly in public. He attended church regularly, presented himself as a devout Christian, involved himself in community affairs. He was married, lived a conventional life, maintained friendships and social connections. Nobody looking at Arnfinn Neset saw a killer. They saw a dedicated healthcare professional who occasionally seemed tired or stressed. But who wouldn't be? Managing a facility full of dying elderly patients? The psychological profile of what Neset became remains chilling in its implications. He wasn't killing from rage or sexual compulsion like many serial killers. His murders weren't crimes of passion or opportunity. They were executions conducted with cold calculation, motivated by factors that remain murky even after his confession. Some psychologists theorize he experienced a god complex, deriving satisfaction from holding power over life and death. Others suggest he may have been alleviating his own existential dread by repeatedly conquering death itself, proving he could control it. Still, others point to possible mercy-killing motivations twisted into something darker. Whatever drove him, the result was systematic slaughter conducted over years while society slept, unaware that one of their trusted caregivers had become one of Norway's worst serial killers. The death count mounted silently, methodically, as Neset refined his technique and expanded his confidence. 22 confirmed victims, but the true number? Investigators believe it could be much higher, possibly dozens more deaths that occurred before the pattern was finally recognized. The nursing home became a stage where Neset performed his dual roles flawlessly. By day, the compassionate manager who comforted grieving families and ensured quality care. By night, the predator who stalked hallways with syringes filled with death. He inhabited both personas completely, switching between them seamlessly, and for years nobody suspected the monster hiding behind the healer's mask. His victims died alone, confused, terrified. In their final moments, as paralysis crept through their bodies and suffocation began, perhaps some of them recognized Neset standing over them. Perhaps they tried to understand why their trusted caregiver had become their executioner. But with their muscles frozen and their lungs failing, they couldn't ask questions or beg for mercy. They could only experience the horror as consciousness faded and death claimed them. This was Arnfinn Neset's kingdom of death, carefully constructed, meticulously maintained, and hidden in plain sight within an institution designed to provide care and dignity to the elderly. For years, he reigned unchallenged, a serial killer protected by society's trust in healthcare institutions and the invisibility of his elderly victims. But kingdoms fall, authority crumbles, and eventually even the most careful predator makes a mistake. The unraveling began not with dramatic revelation but with whispers and inconsistencies that accumulated like pressure behind a dam. The year was 1981, for years into Neset's confirmed killing spree, though investigators would later determine his crimes stretched back further. The Orkdal Valley nursing home's mortality statistics had reached levels that couldn't be ignored indefinitely, even accounting for the advanced age of residents. Too many deaths, too many coincidences, too many bodies piling up under one manager's watch. The first crack in Neset's armor came from an unexpected direction: inventory discrepancies. A routine audit of pharmaceutical supplies revealed that Curacet, a medication with limited legitimate use in a nursing home setting, was disappearing at alarming rates. The drug was supposed to be tightly controlled, used only in specific medical procedures that rarely occurred in long-term care facilities. Yet, Orkdal Valley was going through supplies far faster than could be explained by authorized usage. Hospital administrators initially assumed documentation errors or theft by staff. Medication diversion wasn't uncommon in healthcare settings. Employees sometimes stole painkillers or sedatives for personal use or resale, but Curacet held no recreational value, couldn't be sold on the black market. It had no purpose outside legitimate medical procedures unless someone wanted to paralyze another human being. Questions were asked. Neset provided explanations that seemed plausible at first glance. Documentation had been sloppy, he admitted. Some supplies might have been wasted or expired and disposed of improperly. He'd tighten inventory controls going forward. His reputation as a competent, trustworthy manager bought him credibility. But the explanations didn't fully satisfy everyone, and quiet concerns began circulating among administrative staff. Around the same time, a doctor named Thorstein Sovik began noticing patterns in death certificates crossing his desk. As a physician who signed off on many nursing home deaths, Sovik had reviewed countless cases of elderly patients passing from expected causes. But something about the Orkdal Valley deaths nagged at him. The circumstances were too similar. Patients who'd been relatively stable would suddenly deteriorate overnight, dying from respiratory or cardiac failure before morning. The timing clustered oddly, and Neset's name appeared consistently in the documentation. Sovik couldn't point to any single case that screamed murder, but the aggregate pattern troubled him deeply. He began asking careful questions. reviewing records more thoroughly, cross-referencing death rates against other facilities. The numbers told a disturbing story. Orkdal Valley's mortality rate exceeded comparable nursing homes by a significant margin. The statistical anomaly was stark once you looked for it, but it required someone actively investigating to notice the pattern. Medical professionals who later analyzed the case expressed frustration that warning signs hadn't triggered earlier intervention. But their criticism underestimated how thoroughly Nesset had camouflaged his crimes within the expected background noise of geriatric deaths. Each individual case appeared unremarkable. Only the pattern revealed the predator, and recognizing patterns required someone with access to comprehensive data and willingness to suspect the unthinkable. By early 1981, suspicions had crystallized enough that authorities launched a preliminary investigation. It started quietly. Hospital administrators didn't want to create scandal if their concerns proved unfounded. Investigators began interviewing staff, reviewing records, and examining the circumstances surrounding recent deaths. Most staff had noticed nothing suspicious and spoke highly of Nesset. He was their boss, after all, the person who set workplace culture and held power over their employment. If anyone had harbored private doubts, they'd kept them buried. But investigations have momentum. Once started, they uncover additional threads to pull. A nurse mentioned that Nesset sometimes sent staff away during specific patient interactions. Another recalled odd statements he'd made about death and suffering. Someone else remembered medication storage protocols that hadn't been followed. Individually, these observations meant little. Collectively, they sketched an outline of something horrifying. The breakthrough came when investigators decided to exhume bodies. This was an aggressive move that required substantial justification, significant expense, and bureaucratic approval. Norwegian authorities didn't casually dig up graves, but the accumulated evidence, medication discrepancies, mortality statistics, witness statements had reached critical mass. If Curacet had been used to commit murder, traces might still be detectable in recently deceased victims if testing occurred quickly enough. The toxicology results detonated like bombs. Curacet was present in exhumed bodies at levels that couldn't possibly occur naturally or through legitimate medical treatment. The victims had been poisoned, paralyzed, suffocated. What had appeared to be peaceful deaths in sleep were actually murders. Terrified elderly people dying in agony while their muscles refused to obey, their lungs refused to draw breath, and their killer watched from beside their beds. With physical evidence confirming homicide, the investigation shifted into higher gear. Police arrested Arnfinn Nesset on March 9, 1982. The charges were staggering. Murder and attempted murder of 27 patients through Curacet poisoning. The arrest shocked the community. Nesset? Impossible. He was a respected professional, a churchgoer, a seemingly normal man. But the evidence was undeniable, and as investigators dug deeper, the horror metastasized. During initial questioning, Nesset maintained innocence, but his denials lacked conviction. He was a careful man who'd spent years controlling information flow and managing perceptions, but he wasn't prepared for the focused scrutiny of criminal investigation. His explanations contradicted physical evidence. His alibis crumbled under examination. The medication records painted a damning picture that couldn't be explained away. Investigators searched his home and office, uncovering additional evidence. Records that should have been in hospital files were found hidden in his personal possession. His access logs showed presence in medication storage areas during suspicious timeframes. Witness statements placed him in victim rooms shortly before deaths occurred. The circumstantial evidence formed an overwhelming pattern, and the toxicology reports provided physical proof. The media frenzy began slowly, then exploded. Norway was a peaceful country with very low violent crime rates. Serial killers were things that happened in America or Britain, not in quiet Norwegian valleys. The idea that a trusted healthcare manager had systematically murdered elderly patients under his care violated fundamental assumptions about institutional safety and professional ethics. Families who'd entrusted their loved ones to Orkdal Valley Nursing Home faced the nightmarish realization that those vulnerable people had been delivered to a predator. Nesset's wife filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. Friends and colleagues distanced themselves. The man who'd been so respected, so admired, so trusted, became instantly toxic. His former supporters struggled to reconcile the person they'd known with the monster described in news reports. Some initially defended him, insisting there must be a mistake, that evidence was being misinterpreted. But as more details emerged, those defenses collapsed. Psychological evaluations were ordered to determine Neset's competency and mental state. The results were disturbing. He wasn't insane in any legal sense. He knew right from wrong, understood his actions, and had taken extensive precautions to avoid detection. This was goal-oriented behavior, not psychotic break. The psychologists found him cold, emotionally detached, and displaying characteristics of severe personality disorders. He viewed his victims as objects, not people. Their suffering and deaths had been abstract problems to be managed efficiently rather than moral catastrophes to be avoided. Pressure mounted for Neset to confess. Investigators knew they had sufficient evidence for conviction on some charges, but they wanted the full truth. How many victims? When did the killing start? What motivated the murders? Was he working alone? The prosecution needed comprehensive answers to close cases and provide families with resolution. Eventually, under sustained questioning and confronted with overwhelming evidence, Neset's resistance broke. He confessed to 22 murders over a 5-year period from 1977 to 1981. The confession was clinical, devoid of emotion, delivered in the same matter-of-fact tone he'd once used for administrative reports. Yes, he'd injected patients with Curacip. Yes, he'd watched them die. Yes, he'd known exactly what he was doing. The words were simple, but their implications were monstrous. The confession brought relief to investigators, but devastating confirmation to victims' families. People who'd mourned what they believed were natural deaths now had to process the reality that their loved ones had been murdered. Elderly parents, grandparents, vulnerable people who'd spent their final days in what should have been safe care had instead been systematically executed by the man charged with protecting them. Neset offered various explanations for his crimes that failed to satisfy anyone. He claimed some victims had been suffering and he'd acted from mercy. But investigators found no medical evidence of unusual suffering in his victim selection, and mercy killing didn't explain why he'd murdered some patients who were relatively healthy while ignoring others in worse condition. He suggested stress and mental breakdown, but the carefully planned, methodical nature of the crimes contradicted impulsive behavior born from psychological collapse. He implied he didn't know why he'd done it, that the impulses were inexplicable even to himself. The truth, as much as it could be determined, seemed to be that Neset killed because he could, because it satisfied some dark need for power and control, because he enjoyed playing God with life and death, and because the vulnerability of his victims and the inadequacy of oversight mechanisms made them perfect prey. He was a predator who'd found an ideal hunting ground and exploited it until external pressure finally forced accountability. As the case moved toward trial, the scope of potential victims expanded. 22 confirmed murders, but how many others? Neset had worked in healthcare for over a decade before arriving at Orkdal Valley. Investigators began examining death rates at his previous facilities, looking for similar patterns. The results were chilling. Statistical anomalies appeared at multiple locations where Neset had worked, suggesting his killing might have begun years earlier than the confirmed victims. The true death toll could be 40, 50, perhaps even higher. But without physical evidence or clear documentation, these remained terrible suspicions rather than prosecutable crimes. Norway faced a crisis of confidence in its healthcare institutions. How had this happened? What systemic failures had allowed a serial killer to operate undetected for so long in a licensed care facility? The questions demanded answers, and those answers revealed uncomfortable truths about oversight gaps, implicit trust in medical professionals, and the invisibility of elderly victims in society's consciousness. Neset's kingdom of death had fallen, but the damage extended far beyond his confirmed victim count. Trust had been shattered. Families questioned whether their elderly relatives were truly safe in institutional care. Healthcare workers faced increased scrutiny and suspicion. The comfortable assumption that licensed professionals could be trusted implicitly was replaced with paranoia and doubt. And through it all, Arnfinn Neset sat in custody, emotionally flat, offering minimal cooperation, showing no remorse for the lives he'd extinguished. The trial would soon begin, and Norway would have to confront the full horror of what had occurred in the quiet nursing home in Orkdal Valley. The trial of Arnfinn Neset began on October 18, 1982, in the Trondheim District Court. Norway's legal system wasn't accustomed to cases of this magnitude. The country's most prolific serial killer sat in the defendant's chair, facing charges that encompassed 22 confirmed murders and 1 attempted murder. The courtroom filled with journalists, legal observers, victims' family members, and citizens struggling to comprehend how such systematic horror had unfolded in their peaceful society. Neset appeared in court looking ordinary, middle-aged, balding, wearing glasses, dressed in conservative clothing. There was nothing visually monstrous about him, no obvious warning signs of the predator beneath the surface. This ordinariness became part of the trial's disturbing impact. The monster looked like anyone's colleague, neighbor, or family member. Evil wore a human face that blended seamlessly into society. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Lead prosecutor Sven Holden constructed a timeline of death that stretched across 5 years, demonstrating clear patterns in victim selection, method, and opportunity. Toxicology reports were presented showing curacit in exhumed bodies at levels consistent with homicide. Medical experts testified about how the drug worked, the symptoms it caused, and the suffering victims would have experienced during their final moments. The clinical testimony couldn't convey the full horror, but family members sitting in the gallery filled in those gaps with their imagination and grief. Evidence established that Neset had unique access to medication storage, controlled inventory records, and was present in the nursing home during virtually every suspicious death. Staff testified about his unusual behavior, sending nurses on errands that removed them from specific hallways, taking personal interest in certain patients, spending time alone with victims shortly before their deaths. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, and the physical evidence was irrefutable. The defense faced an impossible task. Neset's confession had already established guilt, and the forensic evidence was conclusive. Defense attorney Pierre Monson couldn't argue innocence, so instead focused on mitigation, attempting to establish mental health issues, diminished capacity, or circumstances that might reduce culpability. The strategy was legally sound but practically futile given the calculated, prolonged nature of the crimes. Psychiatric experts for the defense evaluated Neset extensively, searching for explanations that might contextualize his behavior. They found personality disorders, emotional detachment, and psychological abnormalities. But none of these rose to the level of legal insanity. Neset understood right and wrong. He'd taken elaborate precautions to avoid detection. He'd planned his crimes carefully. He'd maintained his professional facade for years. These were the actions of someone in full command of their faculties, not someone experiencing psychotic break or diminished capacity. The prosecution hammered this point repeatedly. Neset wasn't insane. He was evil. He'd made conscious choices to murder vulnerable people who trusted him. He'd weaponized his position of authority to facilitate systematic killing. The murders weren't crimes of passion or impulse. They were cold, calculated executions carried out over years while Neset maintained the appearance of respectability and competence. Testimony from family members provided the trial's most emotionally devastating moments. Adult children described entrusting their elderly parents to Neset's care, believing they'd made responsible decisions to ensure proper end-of-life care. Instead, they'd delivered their loved ones to a killer. The guilt and anguish in their testimony was palpable. They'd chosen that nursing home specifically because of its good reputation, because Neset seemed so caring and professional. They'd been deceived completely, and their trust had cost their parents' lives. One daughter testified about her mother's final days, describing how Neset had been particularly attentive, visiting frequently, always present during decline. At the time, she'd been grateful for his dedication. Now she understood those visits differently. He'd been monitoring his victim, waiting for opportunity, preparing for murder. The realization that she'd thanked him, that she'd expressed appreciation for his care in the days after her mother's death, was a trauma compounding the original loss. The courtroom heard details of each confirmed victim, Elderly men and women who'd lived full lives, raised families, contributed to their communities, and deserved peaceful, dignified deaths. Instead, they'd experienced paralysis and suffocation, dying in terror and confusion while their killer watched. The prosecution personalized each victim, giving them names and histories, ensuring the court understood these weren't abstract statistics, but real people whose lives had value and meaning. Nesset himself proved to be a problematic defendant. He sat quietly through most testimony, showing little emotional response. When called to testify, his answers were brief, clinical, oddly detached. He confirmed his confession, acknowledged the facts of his crimes, but offered minimal explanation for his motivations. When pressed about why he'd killed these specific people, he claimed he didn't really know. When asked about his feelings during the murders, he described watching patients die with something approaching curiosity rather than horror or satisfaction. This emotional flatness disturbed the courtroom. People wanted either monster or broken human, someone expressing savage defiance or someone devastated by remorse. Nesset offered neither. He was bureaucratic, matter-of-fact, treating his trial like an unpleasant administrative proceeding rather than a reckoning for mass murder. The disconnect between his crime's enormity and his emotional response was profoundly unsettling. Cross-examination exposed contradictions in Nesset's testimony. He claimed some victims had been mercy killings, that he'd been trying to end suffering. But medical records showed many victims had been relatively stable, not in acute distress. His victim selection didn't correlate with medical need for euthanasia. The mercy-killing claim appeared to be post hoc rationalization rather than genuine motivation. When pressed harder, Nesset admitted that power and control had been factors. He'd enjoyed having authority over life and death. The ability to decide who would die and when had satisfied something in him. This confession of power-driven killing was more honest but also more chilling. It revealed Nesset as someone who'd killed not from misguided compassion but from darker impulses related to dominance and control. The prosecution introduced evidence suggesting the actual victim count might be substantially higher than 22. Statistical analysis of previous facilities where Nesset had worked showed elevated mortality rates. But without physical evidence or specific confessions, these remained unprovable suspicions. The prosecutor noted grimly that 22 confirmed murders likely represented only a fraction of Nesset's actual killing. Medical professionals testified about the systemic failures that had allowed Nesset to operate undetected. Medication inventory controls had been inadequate. Death investigations for elderly nursing home patients were perfunctory. The implicit trust placed in healthcare managers created oversight gaps that predators could exploit. The testimony painted a picture of institutional vulnerability that went beyond one nursing home or one killer. Defense witnesses attempted to establish mitigating factors. Colleagues testified that Nesset had seemed stressed and depressed in the years before his arrest. Psychological experts discussed his emotional problems and personality disorders. The defense argued that while Nesset was legally sane, he was psychologically damaged in ways that diminished moral culpability. The argument was technically sophisticated but emotionally unpersuasive given the magnitude of suffering Nesset had inflicted. The trial stretched across weeks, generating massive media coverage throughout Norway and internationally. The case became emblematic of institutional trust betrayed, of predators hiding in plain sight, of society's vulnerability when authority figures exploit their positions. News coverage examined broader questions about healthcare oversight, elderly care standards, and screening procedures for medical professionals. Public opinion was overwhelmingly hostile toward Nesset. Calls for the death penalty surfaced despite Norway's abolition of capital punishment decades earlier. The public wanted maximum punishment, wanted Nesset removed from society permanently. The anger was visceral and widespread. This wasn't just about one killer but about violation of fundamental social contracts regarding care and protection. As closing arguments approached, the outcome was predetermined. Nesset's guilt was established beyond any doubt. The only question was sentencing. Norwegian law imposed a maximum prison sentence of 21 years, which seemed grotesquely inadequate for 22 murders. But the legal system had limits established before anyone imagined a serial killer of Nesset's magnitude operating within its borders. The prosecutor's closing argument was devastating. He walked through each victim's death, describing their suffering, emphasizing Nesset's betrayal of trust, and demanding maximum punishment. He characterized Nesset as one of Norway's worst criminals, someone who'd systematically murdered the most vulnerable people in society while hiding behind professional credentials and institutional authority. The speech was methodical, factual, and damning. The defense's closing argument focused on mental health issues and asked for consideration of psychological factors. Monson argued that Nesset's crimes, while horrific, emerged from severe personality disorders that warranted treatment consideration alongside punishment. The argument was professionally executed but unconvincing to most observers who saw calculated murder rather than psychological breakdown. Nesset himself was given opportunity for final statement. He stood briefly, acknowledged his crimes, expressed vague regret, and sat down. The statement was perfunctory, devoid of genuine remorse or insight. It was the statement of someone going through required motions rather than someone experiencing genuine repentance or transformation. The jury deliberated for a relatively short time. The evidence was overwhelming, the confession was clear, and the verdict was obvious. On March 11, 1983, Arnfinn Nesset was found guilty of 22 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The courtroom erupted in reactions. Some family members sobbed. Others expressed satisfaction that justice had been achieved. Still others were simply numb from processing months of horrific testimony. Sentencing occurred immediately. The judge imposed 21 years in prison, the maximum sentence available under Norwegian law. He condemned Nesset's crimes as among the worst in Norway's history, characterized him as someone who'd betrayed fundamental societal trust, and expressed hope that he'd never be released back into society. The sentence was maximum punishment within legal constraints, though many felt it inadequate given the body count. Nesset showed minimal reaction to the verdict and sentencing. He was led from the courtroom to begin serving his sentence, leaving behind devastated families, a traumatized community, and a healthcare system forced to confront its vulnerabilities and failures. The trial's conclusion brought some closure but couldn't undo the damage. 22 people were confirmed dead, possibly dozens more. Families had lost loved ones to betrayal and murder rather than natural causes. The nursing home where Nesset had operated was permanently tainted, its reputation destroyed. The broader healthcare community faced difficult questions about oversight and accountability. Norway began implementing reforms designed to prevent similar cases. Medication inventory controls were strengthened. Death investigation procedures for nursing home patients were enhanced. Background checks and psychological screening for healthcare managers became more rigorous. The changes came too late for Nesset's victims, but might prevent future predators from finding similar opportunities. And Arnfinn Nesset disappeared into Norway's prison system, beginning a sentence that most people assumed and hoped would keep him incarcerated for life. But Norwegian law had provisions that would complicate that assumption, and the story of Nesset's crimes didn't end with his conviction. Prison should have been the end of Arnfinn Nesset's story. A monster locked away, permanently removed from society, serving time that would stretch into decades. The 21-year sentence seemed substantial even if inadequate for 22 murders. Most observers assumed Nesset would serve the full term and die in custody. His killing days permanently ended. But Norwegian criminal justice operates under philosophies that prioritize rehabilitation over pure punishment, and those philosophies would lead to decisions that shocked and enraged the public. Nesset's incarceration was unremarkable. He served his time quietly at Trondheim prison, maintaining low profile and causing no disciplinary problems. Prison staff reported that he was cooperative, followed rules, and kept to himself. He participated in work programs and behaved as a model prisoner. To casual observation, he seemed like someone who'd accepted responsibility and was serving his sentence appropriately. But the monster's facade was intact even in prison. Nesset displayed minimal genuine remorse. Psychological evaluations conducted during his incarceration found him largely unchanged from the person who'd committed systematic murder. He intellectually acknowledged wrongdoing but showed limited emotional engagement with his crime's impact. The empathy that should have come with genuine rehabilitation was absent. He remained the same cold, detached individual who'd watched elderly patients suffocate without apparent emotional response. Norwegian law included provisions for early release through a system designed to reintegrate prisoners into society. Inmates who demonstrated good behavior, participated in rehabilitation programs, and posed minimal recidivism risk could be released before completing full sentences. The system reflected Norway's progressive approach to criminal justice, which emphasized redemption and second chances over permanent incarceration. In 2000, after serving approximately 17 years, Arnfinn Neset became eligible for parole consideration. The prospect of his release ignited immediate controversy. Victims' families mobilized in opposition, arguing that someone who'd committed mass murder should never walk free regardless of good prison behavior. Mental health experts questioned whether someone with Neset's psychological profile could genuinely be rehabilitated. The public reaction was overwhelmingly negative. Polls showed massive opposition to any possibility of early release. But the parole board operated under specific legal frameworks that limited their discretion. Neset had served substantial time. His prison record was clean. He posed no overt disciplinary problems. Under Norwegian law's criteria, he qualified for release consideration despite the severity of his original crimes. The parole system wasn't designed to handle cases like Neset's. Serial killers were rare in Norway, and the legal framework assumed most criminals could be rehabilitated and safely reintegrated. The parole hearing became a national news event. Neset appeared before the board, now elderly himself, still maintaining his characteristic emotional flatness. He expressed regret for his crimes in the same detached, clinical manner he displayed throughout his trial. He assured the board he posed no danger to society. He presented himself as someone who'd served time, reflected on his mistakes, and was ready to live peacefully. The board faced an impossible decision: grant parole and face public outrage for releasing a serial killer. Deny parole and potentially violate the legal framework designed to prevent excessively punitive sentencing. They chose to extend his incarceration beyond the initial 17 years, but the decision was framed as temporary postponement rather than permanent denial. Neset would be eligible for future parole consideration. The public breathed temporarily easier, but the underlying issue remained unresolved. Norwegian law didn't provide mechanisms for true life sentences except in extremely specific circumstances. Eventually, Neset would likely be released unless new legal grounds for continued detention emerged. The conflict between progressive criminal justice philosophy and public safety concerns regarding irredeemable predators became increasingly acute. In 2004, after serving approximately 21 years, his full original sentence, Arnfinn Neset was quietly released from prison. The decision was made with minimal public notification, announced almost as an afterthought in bureaucratic documentation. Authorities hoped to avoid media circus and public hysteria by handling the release as administrative routine rather than major news event. But information leaked. The media discovered that Norway's most prolific serial killer was free, walking among the population with no public notification or monitoring beyond standard parole requirements. The public reaction was explosive. How could someone who'd murdered at least 22 people be released? What possible justification could exist for returning this predator to society? Authorities defended the decision using legal arguments about sentences served and lack of grounds for continued detention. Neset had completed his term. He'd violated no prison rules. Norwegian law didn't permit indefinite detention based on original crime severity alone if the sentence had been served. Releasing him was legally required absent new criminal activity or clear evidence of immediate threat. The defense rang hollow to most Norwegians. Victims' families expressed betrayal and horror. How were they supposed to feel safe knowing their loved one's killer was free? What message did this send about justice and accountability? The release seemed to prioritize Neset's rights over his victim's memory and their family's peace of mind. Neset disappeared into anonymity following release. His exact whereabouts were kept confidential to protect him from vigilante violence and to prevent media harassment. He was given a new identity, relocated to an undisclosed location, and supposedly placed under some level of monitoring, though the extent and effectiveness of that monitoring remained unclear and disputed. The anonymity infuriated the public. A serial killer was living somewhere in Norway, perhaps in their neighborhood, their town, their community, and nobody would know. Parents worried about elderly relatives in nursing homes. Healthcare facilities wondered if the man working as a janitor or administrator might be Neset under a new name. The lack of transparency created paranoia and eroded trust in authorities who'd made the release decision. Investigative journalists attempted to locate Neset, hoping to expose his whereabouts and force accountability. These efforts were largely unsuccessful due to legal protections and government cooperation in maintaining his anonymity. Occasional rumors surfaced. Someone claimed to have spotted him in a specific town. Others reported seeing someone matching his description at a particular location. None of these sightings were confirmed, and most proved to be misidentifications or deliberate misinformation. Mental health experts debated whether someone like Neset could genuinely be rehabilitated. Serial killers, particularly those motivated by power and control rather than specific traumatic triggers, rarely showed genuine reformation. The psychological traits that enabled Neset's crimes, emotional detachment, lack of empathy, ability to objectify victims, were deeply ingrained personality characteristics unlikely to change through conventional rehabilitation programs. Some psychologists argued that Neset's advanced age provided protection. He was elderly now, presumably lacking the energy and opportunity to resume killing. His victims had been vulnerable nursing home patients, and his access to such populations was presumably restricted. From this perspective, release posed minimal actual risk even if it violated moral intuitions about justice. Others countered that age didn't eliminate danger. Neset could still theoretically access vulnerable populations through volunteer work or informal caregiving arrangements. His psychological drives hadn't been extinguished simply because he'd grown older. And even if he never killed again, his presence in society represented injustice and disrespect for his victims' memory. The Norwegian government faced intense criticism over the release decision. Politicians who'd supported progressive criminal justice policies found themselves defending the indefensible, explaining why a serial killer deserved freedom after murdering at least 22 people. Opposition parties seized the issue, arguing for tougher sentencing laws and elimination of parole provisions for violent crimes. Legislative reforms were proposed and debated. Some advocated for preventive detention laws that would allow continued incarceration of dangerous individuals even after sentence completion. Others pushed for mandatory life sentences without parole for serial killers. The proposals faced constitutional challenges and philosophical objections from those committed to rehabilitation-focused justice systems. The debate revealed fundamental tensions in criminal justice philosophy. How should society balance redemption against retribution? When do individual rights to freedom after serving sentences conflict with community rights to safety and peace of mind? Can some crimes be so severe that rehabilitation becomes irrelevant regardless of behavior change? These questions had no easy answers, and Neset's case forced Norway to confront them directly. Victims' families became advocates for criminal justice reform. They testified before parliamentary committees, gave media interviews, and organized campaigns demanding stronger protections against violent criminal release. Their advocacy was personal and powerful. They'd experienced firsthand the consequences of inadequate sentencing and premature release decisions. One daughter whose mother had been murdered by Neset became particularly vocal. She described the trauma of learning her mother's death wasn't natural, the horror of the trial testimony describing suffocation and paralysis, and the ongoing nightmare of knowing her mother's killer walked free. She demanded accountability from officials who'd authorized the release and insisted that legal reforms prevent similar cases in the future. The advocacy created some policy changes. Norway implemented more rigorous risk assessment procedures for violent offender parole. Monitoring requirements for released violent criminals were strengthened. Victim notification systems were improved to ensure families received advance warning of release decisions. But these reforms couldn't undo Neset's release or guarantee he'd never access vulnerable populations again. International criminal justice experts examined the Neset case as cautionary tale about progressive justice system limits. Norway's approach worked reasonably well for typical criminals, thieves, drug offenders, even some violent criminals whose circumstances suggested rehabilitation potential. But serial killers represented edge cases that challenged the system's philosophical foundations. Some countries used Neset's release to justify their own harsher sentencing practices. American commentators pointed to the case as evidence that European justice systems were dangerously lenient. The argument was politically motivated but touched on genuine concerns about whether any amount of rehabilitation could address the fundamental psychological deficits that enable serial killing. Meanwhile, Neset himself remained silent and invisible. He gave no interviews, made no public statements, and maintained complete anonymity. Whether he felt remorse, satisfaction, or indifference about his crimes and their aftermath remained unknown. The man who'd spoken so clinically about murder during his trial revealed nothing about his internal state after release. Healthcare institutions in Norway implemented additional safeguards designed to prevent another Neset-type situation. Background checks became more comprehensive. Psychological screening for positions involving vulnerable populations was standardized. Medication inventory controls were tightened significantly. Death investigation procedures for nursing home patients included more rigorous protocols. These changes represented institutional learning from catastrophic failure, though they came decades too late for Neset's victims. The nursing home where the murders occurred never recovered its reputation. Despite management changes, facility renovations, and new protocols, the stigma remained permanent. Families avoided placing loved ones there. Staff members left for positions elsewhere. Eventually, the facility closed and was repurposed for different use. Its history as a serial killer's hunting ground ensuring it could never again function as a care home. Orkdal Valley itself struggled with the Neset legacy. The small community had been known for natural beauty, quiet Norwegian life, and peaceful retirement living. After the case, it became the place where Norway's worst serial killer had operated. Tourism declined. Property values dropped. Young people left for opportunities elsewhere. The community bore collective trauma from harboring unknowingly a monster who'd systematically murdered its most vulnerable citizens. Psychologists who studied the case noted its impact on societal trust. The Neset murders violated fundamental assumptions about institutional safety and professional ethics. If a nursing home manager, someone specifically chosen and authorized to provide care, could be a serial killer, then who could be trusted? The paranoia extended beyond healthcare to other institutions involving vulnerable populations. Schools, daycare centers, elder care, disability services. The broader cultural impact manifested in Norwegian media and literature. True crime documentaries examined the case repeatedly, analyzing the murders, the investigation, the trial, and the controversial release. Authors wrote books exploring the psychological and sociological dimensions of Neset's crimes. The case became reference point in discussions about evil, institutional failure, and justice system limitations. Investigators who'd worked the original case expressed mixed feelings about the outcome. They'd successfully identified the killer, gathered evidence, secured conviction, and stopped the murders. But seeing Neset released after serving time felt like hollow victory. They'd caught the monster, but the system had let him walk free. Some retired investigators gave interviews expressing frustration that their work had been undermined by inadequate sentencing laws. Families of the 22 confirmed victims formed support groups to process their ongoing trauma. They met regularly to share experiences, support one another, and advocate for policy changes. The groups provided crucial emotional resources for people dealing with complicated grief, mourning loved ones while grappling with betrayal, murder, and systemic failure that had enabled the crimes. Some family members expressed concern about additional unconfirmed victims. If Neset had killed 22 people at Orkdal Valley, what about his previous positions? Statistical evidence suggested elevated mortality rates at earlier facilities, but without physical evidence or confessions, those deaths remained legally unresolved. Family members who'd lost elderly relatives at those facilities wondered whether their losses were also murders rather than natural deaths. The question of Neset's true victim count haunted investigators. 22 confirmed, but probably more, maybe significantly more. One detective who'd worked the case estimated the real number could exceed 50 deaths across Nesset's entire healthcare career. Without comprehensive exhumations and testing at multiple facilities, the full scope would never be known. Many potential victims had been cremated or buried too long for useful testing. This uncertainty compounded the injustice. Not only had Nesset murdered systematically, but many of his crimes would never be confirmed or acknowledged. Families of potential additional victims lacked closure and confirmation. The monster had gotten away with unknown numbers of murders simply because detection came too late for comprehensive investigation. As years passed after Nesset's release, public attention gradually shifted to other issues. The initial outrage faded as new scandals and crises captured media focus. Nesset disappeared into the background of Norwegian consciousness. Still there, still disturbing, but no longer dominating headlines. The walking nightmare became normalized through sheer passage of time. But for those directly affected, victims' families, survivors of attempted murder, the community of Orkdal Valley, investigators who'd worked the case, the nightmare never truly ended. Nesset's freedom represented ongoing trauma, a wound that couldn't heal while the perpetrator lived comfortably in anonymity. Arnfinn Nesset is believed to still be alive today, somewhere in Norway, living under a protected identity. He would be in his 90s now, elderly himself, perhaps experiencing the vulnerability he once exploited in others. Whether he reflects on his crimes with remorse or indifference remains unknown. Whether he's lived peacefully since release or harbored continuing dark impulses that were simply never acted upon is speculation. The final chapter of Arnfinn Nesset's story won't be written until his death. Until then, he remains a living reminder of evil's banality, of systems' failures, of justice's limitations, and of the monsters that hide behind professional credentials and institutional authority. The elderly patients he murdered are long gone. Their suffering ended decades ago. But the ripples of his crimes continue spreading through families, communities, and systems still grappling with the implications. 22 confirmed deaths, possibly dozens more, and a killer who walked free after serving time that most considered grossly inadequate. This is the legacy of Arnfinn Nesset, the angel of death who wore a nurse's uniform, the trusted caregiver who was actually a predator, the serial killer who operated in plain sight for years before being stopped. His victims deserved peaceful, dignified deaths surrounded by people who cared for them. Instead, they died in terror and paralysis, suffocating while their killer watched. And somewhere in Norway, that killer still draws breath, free and anonymous. A walking nightmare that justice could capture but couldn't contain. The monster was caught, tried, convicted, and imprisoned. But ultimately, the monster walked free and walks still. A disturbing reminder that sometimes the system designed to deliver justice falls catastrophically short of that goal. The story of Arnfinn Nesset is complete in its facts but incomplete in its justice. The crimes were solved, but the scales never truly balanced. The victims are gone, the families still grieve, the community still bears scars, and the killer lives on, old, anonymous, and free. This is the nightmare that doesn't end even when the monster is caught. This is the horror that persists when systems fail and evil survives. This is the story of Arnfinn Nesset, and it haunts Norway still. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Monster Who Wore a Smile. Kulthum Akbari story. They say evil doesn't announce itself. It whispers sweet promises while sharpening its blade, and in the case of Kulthum Akbari, those whispers turned into screams that would echo through the corridors of justice for decades to come. What happens when the person you trust most becomes the architect of your destruction? When the face that smiles at you across the dinner table has already planned the exact moment your heart will stop beating. Kulthum Akbari didn't just take lives. She collected them like trophies, each victim a carefully orchestrated masterpiece of manipulation and murder. This is the story of a woman who transformed suburban normalcy into a hunting ground, where poison replaced conversation and death wore lipstick. Before we journey into the darkness she created, ask yourself, how well do you really know the people closest to you? Because Kulthum Akbari's victims thought they knew her too, right until their final, agonizing breath. Nobody suspected Kulthum Akbari of anything more sinister than perhaps being too friendly, too eager to help, too quick with a casserole when neighbors fell ill. The woman who lived at 2847 Maple Drive presented herself as the embodiment of domestic perfection. A devoted wife, a caring daughter-in-law, a friend who remembered birthdays and brought homemade treats to neighborhood gatherings. But behind those warm brown eyes and that practiced smile lurked something far more terrifying than anyone in that quiet suburban community could have imagined. The year was 2009 when the first whispers of suspicion began to curl around Kulthum like smoke from a distant fire. But the seeds of her darkness had been planted years earlier, germinating in soil fertilized by greed, jealousy, and an appetite for control that knew no boundaries. To understand the monster she became, we must first understand the mask she wore so convincingly that even those dying by her hand never suspected her until it was far too late. Kulthum had arrived in the United States from Afghanistan in the late 1990s, bringing with her the appearance of traditional values and family devotion. She married into the Akbari family, a close-knit clan that operated several successful businesses in the Chicago area. To outsiders, she seemed like the perfect addition to their household. Respectful, hardworking, always ready with a smile and a kind word. But what her new family didn't know was that they had invited a predator into their home. One who viewed their wealth and assets not as family treasures, but as prizes to be won through the most heinous means imaginable. The manipulation began subtly, as it always does with the truly dangerous. Kulthum positioned herself as the primary caregiver for the elderly members of the family, volunteering to prepare their meals, administer their medications, and tend to their daily needs. She insisted on this role with such apparent devotion that family members praised her dedication, relieved to have someone so trustworthy handling these intimate responsibilities. They had no way of knowing that every act of kindness was a calculated move in a game where the stakes were life and death, and Kulthum was the only one who knew the rules. The first victim was her father-in-law, Muhammad Akbari, a 72-year-old man whose health had been declining slowly over several years, or so everyone thought. The truth was far more sinister. Kulthum had been gradually poisoning the elderly man, introducing toxic substances into his food with such careful precision that his symptoms mimicked natural deterioration. His family watched helplessly as he grew weaker, more confused, more dependent. They attributed his decline to age and existing health conditions, never imagining that the woman preparing his meals with such apparent care was actually orchestrating his systematic destruction. Muhammad's death in 2006 was ruled as resulting from natural causes. The family grieved, held a traditional funeral, and moved forward with their lives. Kulthum played the role of the devastated daughter-in-law to perfection, weeping at appropriate moments, comforting other family members, and ensuring that everyone saw her as the devoted caregiver who had done everything possible to ease the old man's final days. But behind closed doors, she was already calculating her next move, already identifying her next target. The inheritance from Muhammad's death provided Kulthum with her first taste of the financial rewards that murder could bring. It wasn't a fortune. Elderly parents typically leave their estates to be divided among children, but it was enough to awaken something insatiable within her. Money meant power, security, independence. And if taking a life could bring money, then taking more lives could bring more money. The logic was simple, cold, and utterly devoid of human conscience. Her next victim was her husband's uncle, Nasir Akbari, a 68-year-old man who had never married and lived alone in a small apartment. Kulthum befriended him, visiting regularly, bringing him meals, offering to help manage his medications and doctor's appointments. Nasir was grateful for the attention, touched by what he perceived as genuine familial love. He had no children of his own, and Kulthum's kindness filled a void in his lonely life. He trusted her completely, which made him extraordinarily easy to kill. The method she employed with Nasir demonstrated a chilling evolution in her technique. Rather than the slow poisoning she had used on her father-in-law, Kulthum decided to accelerate the process. She began introducing antifreeze into his food, a substance containing ethylene glycol that, when ingested, causes catastrophic damage to the kidneys and other vital organs. The symptoms are brutal: vomiting, confusion, seizures, eventual organ failure. Nasir suffered through each stage, his body breaking down in ways that seemed medically inexplicable to the doctors who examined him. But here's where Kulthum's true cunning revealed itself. She accompanied Nasir to his medical appointments, always presenting herself as the concerned family member. She answered questions for him when he became too weak or confused to speak clearly. She described his symptoms to doctors, carefully editing and shaping the narrative to lead medical professionals away from suspicion of poisoning. She was essentially controlling the investigation into the very crime she was committing, and she did it with such skill that nobody questioned her involvement. Nasir died in agony over a period of 3 weeks. The official cause of death was listed as acute kidney failure due to unknown causes. Once again, Kulthum mourned publicly while privately celebrating her success. Nasir had named her husband as a beneficiary in his will, which meant more money flowing into their household, more resources under her control. The pattern was becoming clearer to her. Identify vulnerable targets within the family, establish yourself as their caregiver, eliminate them slowly enough that it appears natural or at least ambiguous, then profit from their deaths. But Kulthum's ambitions were growing faster than her patience. The slow poisonings took time, required constant attention, and involved risk of discovery if anyone became suspicious. She needed to think bigger, act bolder. And that's when she set her sights on the most audacious target yet, her own husband's mother, Bibi Akbari. Bibi was a formidable woman, the matriarch of the family, a person who commanded respect and wielded considerable influence over family decisions and finances. She was also the primary obstacle standing between Kulthum and complete control over her husband's portion of the family wealth. As long as Bibi lived, she maintained oversight of various properties and accounts, doling out money carefully and maintaining traditional family structures. For Kulthum, Bibi represented both the ultimate challenge and the ultimate prize. The campaign against Bibi began in 2007 and would prove to be Kulthum's most elaborate and brutal performance. Bibi was strong-willed and sharp-minded despite her age, which meant Kulthum would need to be more aggressive in her approach. She started by isolating Bibi from other family members, suggesting that the elderly woman needed more specialized care that only she could provide. She moved Bibi into her own home, claiming it would be easier to monitor her health and ensure she took her medications properly. What followed was a masterclass in psychological and physical torture disguised as caregiving. Kulthum began administering incorrect medications, mixing pharmaceuticals in dangerous combinations that would cause confusion, weakness, and dependency. She controlled Bibi's food intake, alternating between near starvation and force-feeding to keep the elderly woman's body in a constant state of stress and imbalance. She manipulated visitors, limiting their time with Bibi and always ensuring she was present during any conversations, ready to interpret or interrupt as needed. But the physical abuse was only part of Kulthum's assault on Bibi. The psychological torture was equally calculated and perhaps even more cruel. She would whisper terrible things to Bibi when they were alone, telling her that her children didn't love her, that they saw her as a burden, that they wished she would die so they could inherit her money. She created an environment of complete dependence and fear, where Bibi's entire world shrank down to the 4 walls of her room and the woman who controlled whether she ate, whether she received pain medication, whether she lived in comfort or agony. Family members who visited noticed that Bibi seemed to be declining rapidly, becoming more withdrawn and fearful. But Kulthum was always there with explanations. Dementia was setting in, she would say, or depression over aging was taking its toll. She played the role of the exhausted but devoted caregiver so convincingly that family members felt guilty for not helping more, never suspecting that the person claiming to care for Bibi was actually destroying her piece by piece. The poisoning of Bibi Akbari lasted nearly a year, a prolonged execution that demonstrated Cultham's complete lack of empathy or conscience. She experimented with different substances, different dosages, observing the effects with the detached curiosity of a scientist conducting research rather than a family member causing suffering. Rat poison, household cleaners, excessive doses of prescription medications, all found their way into Bibi's body, each introducing new symptoms and accelerating her decline. By the time Bibi Akbari died in 2008, she weighed barely 80 pounds and had endured suffering that no human being should experience. Her death certificate listed the cause as multiple organ failure secondary to chronic illness, but the reality was that she had been murdered slowly and deliberately by the woman her family had trusted to keep her safe. The irony was devastating. They had placed their beloved mother in the hands of her killer and thanked Kulthum for her dedication while Bibi died in agony. The inheritance from Bibi's death was substantial. Properties, investments, cash assets, all flowing to her children, including Kulthum's husband. For the first time, Kulthum had access to real wealth, the kind of money that could transform her life and provide the security and luxury she had always craved. But rather than satisfaction, this success only fed her appetite for more. She had discovered that she could kill with impunity, that her performance as the devoted caregiver was foolproof, that the rewards for murder far exceeded any risk of discovery. What the family didn't know, what nobody outside Kulthum's dark inner world could have guessed, was that these deaths were just the beginning. The monster had tasted blood, had learned how easy it was to take life without consequence, and she was far from finished hunting. The years following Bibi Akbari's death should have been a time of mourning and family healing, but for Kulthum, they represented opportunity. She had perfected her methods, refined her performance, and most importantly, she had developed an addiction to the power that came with taking human life. The money was important, certainly, but there was something else driving her now, something darker and more fundamental. She had become intoxicated by her own ability to decide who lived and who died, to watch people suffer and know that she alone controlled their fate. Her next victim was her sister-in-law, Rabia Akbari, a 47-year-old woman who had been diagnosed with diabetes and relied on carefully managed insulin treatments to maintain her health. Rabia was a kind woman, generous to fault, always thinking of others before herself. She had welcomed Kulthum into the family with open arms, defending her against occasional criticisms from more suspicious family members. That loyalty would cost Rabia her life. Kulthum volunteered to help Rabia manage her diabetes, offering to prepare special meals that would keep her blood sugar stable and even assisting with her insulin injections. For someone with diabetes, having help managing the disease seemed like a blessing. Careful monitoring could mean the difference between health and medical crisis. But in Kulthum's hands, this medical management became a weapon of devastating efficiency. The manipulation of insulin levels is particularly insidious because the symptoms of intentional poisoning mirror those of natural diabetic complications. Too much insulin causes hypoglycemia, dangerously low blood sugar that leads to confusion, seizures, loss of consciousness, and if severe enough, death. Too little insulin leads to hyperglycemia and diabetic ketoacidosis, another potentially fatal condition. By carefully manipulating Rabia's insulin doses and dietary intake, Kulthum created a medical roller coaster that left her victim in constant crisis while appearing to be the result of disease rather than murder. The attacks on Rabia were particularly cruel because they involved repeated near-death experiences. Kulthum would induce severe hypoglycemic episodes, bringing Rabia to the brink of death, then discover her in distress and summon emergency help, playing the role of the frantic family member who had heroically saved her sister-in-law's life. This happened multiple times over several months, each incident taking a terrible toll on Rabia's body and mind, weakening her progressively while establishing Kulthum as a devoted caregiver in the eyes of medical professionals and family members. But Kulthum wasn't content to simply kill Rabia through insulin manipulation. She began introducing other elements into her torture regime. She contaminated Rabia's food with various substances that would exacerbate her diabetic complications or create new symptoms that confused doctors. She administered medications that Rabia wasn't prescribed, creating dangerous drug interactions. She isolated Rabia from other family members during her weakest moments, controlling the narrative about her condition and ensuring that nobody questioned the care she was receiving. The psychological torture was equally calculated. During moments when Rabia was confused or weakened by insulin shock, Kulthum would whisper terrible things to her, telling her that her suffering was punishment, that her family was tired of dealing with her illness, that she would be better off dead. These attacks on Rabia's mental state were designed to break her spirit, to make her compliant and dependent, to ensure she wouldn't fight back or seek help from others. Rabia Akbari died in 2009 after a particularly severe hypoglycemic episode left her brain damaged and unable to recover. The official ruling was that her diabetes had become uncontrollable despite the best efforts of her caregivers, and that complications from the disease had ultimately claimed her life. Kulthum received condolences and praise for her tireless efforts to keep Rabia alive. Nobody suspected that the woman they were thanking had actually orchestrated every element of Rabia's suffering and death. With Rabia's death, Kulthum had now killed 4 family members, and the pattern should have been becoming obvious. But here's the truly frightening aspect of her crimes. The murders were spaced out over several years, affected different age groups with different health conditions, and were executed with enough variation in method that connecting them seemed impossible. To any outside observer, the Akbari family was simply experiencing a series of tragic but natural deaths, the kind of losses that afflict many families over time. The idea that one person was systematically eliminating family members for financial gain seemed too monstrous to consider. But Kulthum's killing spree was far from over, and her confidence was growing with each successful murder. She had learned that the medical establishment, when presented with symptoms that could be explained by natural causes or existing conditions, rarely looked deeper for evidence of poisoning or abuse. She had learned that family members, grieving and traumatized, were easy to manipulate and control. Most importantly, she had learned that she could kill without consequence, that her mask of devoted caregiving was impenetrable. Her next victim represented a departure from her previous pattern, and it demonstrated just how brazen Kulthum had become. Rather than targeting elderly or sick family members, she set her sights on her nephew, Hamid Akbari, a 28-year-old man in perfect health who was about to receive a substantial inheritance from his grandmother's estate. Hamid was engaged to be married, planning a future, completely unaware that his aunt had decided he needed to die. The challenge with Hamid was that he was young, healthy, and active. There were no existing medical conditions to mask her attacks, no medications she could manipulate, no caregiving role she could claim. She would need to be more creative, more aggressive, and more willing to take risks. And she was ready for all of that. Kulthum began by inviting Hamid to her home for regular family dinners, positioning herself as the cool aunt who understood young people and wanted to stay connected. Hamid, who had always liked his aunt, accepted these invitations readily, enjoying the home-cooked meals and the attention. He had no way of knowing that each meal was potentially his last, that the woman smiling at him across the table was actually calculating the best way to end his life. The poisoning of Hamid was particularly aggressive. Kulthum used thallium, a heavy metal that was once used in rat poisons and is extraordinarily toxic to humans. Even small doses of thallium cause severe neurological damage, hair loss, kidney failure, and excruciating pain. The symptoms develop slowly enough that initial exposure isn't immediately obvious, but once the poison reaches critical levels in the body, the deterioration is rapid and brutal. Over the course of several weeks, Kulthum introduced thallium into Hamid's food during family dinners. He began experiencing strange symptoms: tingling in his extremities, severe abdominal pain, hair falling out in clumps. He visited doctors repeatedly, undergoing test after test, but because thallium poisoning is rare and not included in standard toxicology screens, the source of his illness remained mysterious. His doctors were baffled, proposing various diagnoses that ranged from autoimmune disorders to rare neurological conditions. As Hamid's condition worsened, he became unable to work, eventually becoming bedridden and requiring constant care. And who stepped forward to provide that care? Kulthum, of course, positioning herself once again as the devoted family member willing to sacrifice her time and energy to help a loved one through a medical crisis. She moved Hamid into her home, claiming it would be easier to manage his care, effectively isolating him from other family members and ensuring complete control over his treatment, his diet, and his communication with the outside world. The final weeks of Hamid's life were marked by unspeakable suffering. The thallium had caused extensive damage to his nervous system, leaving him in constant pain, unable to sleep, experiencing hallucinations and seizures. His once athletic body had become a twisted shell, racked with spasms and barely responsive. And through it all, Kulthum played the devoted caregiver, administering pain medications that provided no real relief because she was simultaneously continuing to poison him with thallium. Hamid Akbari died in 2010 at the age of 28, his body destroyed by toxic exposure that would never be identified during his lifetime. The official cause of death was listed as multiple organ failure due to unknown etiology, medical language for, "We have no idea what killed this young man." His family was devastated, unable to comprehend how someone so young and healthy could deteriorate so rapidly. And Kulthum stood at his funeral, tears streaming down her face, accepting hugs and condolences while calculating how much money would now flow to her husband as Hamid's inheritance was redistributed among surviving family members. By 2011, Kulthum Akbari had killed 5 people, accumulated significant wealth through inheritances and insurance payouts, and remained completely unsuspected by anyone who knew her. She had become a ghost moving through her family's life, leaving death in her wake while maintaining a facade of normalcy that was truly masterful in its execution. But her appetite for killing had only grown stronger, and her sense of invulnerability had made her dangerously reckless. The acceleration of her murders became obvious in hindsight but remained invisible to those living through it. She began targeting multiple victims simultaneously, managing several poisoning campaigns at once like a conductor leading a symphony of death. She expanded beyond immediate family members to include friends, neighbors, and acquaintances who had money or assets she coveted. Each victim received the same treatment: the friendly approach, the offer of help, the establishment of trust, followed by the systematic poisoning and psychological torture that had become her signature. What made Kulthum particularly dangerous was her ability to compartmentalize her crimes. She could poison someone's food at dinner, watch them become violently ill, call for emergency help, and then attend a social gathering the same evening without showing any signs of guilt or stress. She lived in 2 worlds simultaneously, one where she was a murderer actively destroying human lives, and another where she was a respectable community member with friends and social obligations. The wall between these worlds was apparently impenetrable, allowing her to function without the burden of conscience or moral doubt. By 2011, Kulthum Akbari had transformed from a careful, methodical killer into something far more dangerous, a serial poisoner operating with complete confidence in her immunity from detection. The success of her previous murders had created a feedback loop of escalating violence. Each killing emboldened her to attempt more audacious crimes, to take greater risks, to expand her hunting ground beyond family members into the broader community. She had become addicted not just to the financial rewards but to the act of killing itself, to the godlike power of deciding who would live and who would die. Her victims during this period included an elderly neighbor named Shirley Davidson, a 74-year-old widow who had befriended Kulthum and made the fatal mistake of mentioning that she had nobody to leave her estate to when she died. That casual comment sealed Shirley's fate. Kulthum immediately began positioning herself as Shirley's closest friend, the daughter she never had, visiting daily with food and companionship. She convinced Shirley to update her will, naming Kulthum as a beneficiary, "Since we're so close and you've been so kind to me." The murder of Shirley Davidson was particularly cynical because it involved the betrayal of genuine friendship. Shirley wasn't a family member who might be suspected of ulterior motives. She was a lonely woman who had opened her heart to someone she believed cared about her. The betrayal was absolute and devastating. Kulthum poisoned Shirley's food with a combination of arsenic and prescription medications, creating symptoms that appeared to be natural decline associated with age and existing health conditions. Shirley's death took 3 months of progressive suffering. She experienced severe gastrointestinal problems, confusion, weakness, and pain that her doctors attributed to various age-related conditions. Kulthum was there through it all, playing the role of devoted friend, bringing meals and medications, sitting with Shirley during her worst moments. Nobody questioned her presence or her access to Shirley's food and medications. Nobody suspected that the woman holding Shirley's hand as she died was the same person who had poisoned her. When Shirley Davidson died in late 2011, she left Cutham a bequest of $75,000 and several pieces of valuable jewelry. At the funeral, Cutham delivered a touching eulogy about friendship and loss that left mourners in tears. She spoke about how much Shirley had meant to her, how grateful she was for their time together, how she would treasure Shirley's memory forever. It was a performance worthy of an Oscar, delivered by a woman who had murdered her supposed friend for money and felt absolutely no remorse about doing so. But Shirley Davidson was not the only person outside the Akbari family to fall victim to Cutham's poisoning campaign. There was Mohammed Rizvi, a 61-year-old business associate of her husband, who made the mistake of asking Cutham to help care for his wife during a serious illness. Cutham seized this opportunity to gain access to their home and finances, and within months both Mohammed and his wife Aisha were dead from what appeared to be complications from Aisha's cancer treatment. In reality, Cutham had poisoned them both, accelerating Aisha's death and then eliminating Mohammed before he could question the circumstances of his wife's passing. The brutality of these murders cannot be overstated. Cutham wasn't content with simple poisonings that caused relatively quick deaths. She enjoyed watching her victims suffer, experimenting with different dosages and combinations to prolong their agony. She would sometimes reduce the poison temporarily, allowing victims to experience brief periods of improvement that gave them hope, only to resume the poisoning with even greater intensity. This psychological torture, the creation of false hope followed by renewed suffering, demonstrated a level of cruelty that went beyond mere criminal behavior into the realm of sadistic personality disorder. In 2012, Cutham's campaign of murder reached its most ambitious phase. She began simultaneously poisoning 3 different people: her husband's cousin Jabir, a family friend named Fatima Khan, and a young woman named Mariam who worked at a local grocery store that Cutham frequented. The selection of these victims revealed the randomness and scope of her killing. Jabir represented continuing financial gain within the family structure. Fatima had offended Cutham during a social gathering, and Cutham decided she needed to be punished. Mariam's only crime was mentioning to Cutham that she had recently received a settlement from a car accident and didn't know what to do with the money. The management of 3 simultaneous murder campaigns required extraordinary organizational skills and a complete absence of conscience. Cutham kept detailed mental notes about which poisons she had given to whom, which symptoms each victim should be experiencing, and what she needed to do next to advance each killing. She visited each victim regularly, bringing food and drinks laced with toxins, always playing the role of concerned friend or family member. She attended social events and family gatherings while actively poisoning multiple people, never showing any signs of the monster lurking behind her smile. Jabir died first in March 2012 from what appeared to be a sudden heart attack. He had been experiencing chest pain and difficulty breathing for weeks, symptoms that Cutham had created through careful administration of drugs that affected his cardiovascular system. His death was ruled as cardiac arrest, and once again Cutham received sympathy and praise for trying to help him during his final illness. Fatima Khan's death was slower and more agonizing. Cutham used a combination of heavy metal poisoning and caustic substances that destroyed Fatima's digestive system from the inside out. The pain was extraordinary. Fatima spent her final weeks unable to eat without excruciating suffering, vomiting blood, losing massive amounts of weight. Her doctors suspected cancer but couldn't find a tumor. They ran test after test, subjecting Fatima to invasive procedures while searching for a disease that didn't exist because the real cause of her suffering was the trusted friend who brought her homemade soup and sat beside her hospital bed. When Fatima Khan died in June 2012, she weighed 82 pounds and had endured suffering that should never be inflicted on any human being. The official cause of death was listed as catastrophic gastrointestinal failure of unknown origin. Her family was traumatized by watching her suffer without understanding why, without being able to help her or even identify what was killing her. And Cutham attended the funeral, once again playing her role perfectly, weeping for the friend she had murdered. Mariam, the young grocery store clerk, represented perhaps the most senseless of Cutham's murders. This was a 23-year-old woman with her entire life ahead of her, someone who had done nothing more than be friendly to a customer and mention receiving some money. For this, Kulthum decided she should die, and the execution of this murder revealed just how far gone she truly was. Kulthum befriended Mariam, convincing her to accept financial advice and even offering to help her invest her settlement money. Mariam, trusting and naive, welcomed this assistance from an older woman who seemed genuinely interested in helping her. She had no way of knowing that accepting this friendship was a death sentence. The poisoning of Mariam was particularly aggressive. Kulthum used cyanide, one of the fastest-acting and most lethal poisons available. But she didn't give Mariam a fatal dose immediately. Instead, she administered small amounts over several weeks, creating symptoms of severe illness, headaches, confusion, difficulty breathing, seizures. Mariam was hospitalized repeatedly, with doctors unable to identify the cause of her mysterious illness. And during one of her hospital stays, Kulthum visited and administered a final, fatal dose of cyanide in what appeared to be a friendly gesture of bringing homemade tea. Mariam died within hours of drinking that tea, her young body finally succumbing to the cumulative effects of the poison Kulthum had been feeding her. The death was ruled as resulting from complications of an unidentified illness, and once again, Kulthum walked away without suspicion. She had murdered a girl young enough to be her daughter for no reason other than greed and the satisfaction of taking a life. By mid-2012, Kulthum Akbari had killed at least 9 people, with several more victims lingering in various stages of being poisoned. The body count was staggering, and the variety of methods she employed demonstrated both her intelligence and her complete moral bankruptcy. She had used insulin, antifreeze, thallium, arsenic, cyanide, prescription medications, and various household toxins. She had killed the elderly, the middle-aged, and the young. She had murdered family members and strangers alike. And through it all, she maintained her facade of respectability so effectively that nobody suspected the scope of her crimes. But cracks were beginning to appear in her perfect mask. Family members were starting to notice that death seemed to follow Kulthum wherever she went, that an unusual number of people in her orbit were becoming seriously ill or dying under mysterious circumstances. A few relatives began quietly discussing their concerns, noting the pattern that seemed too consistent to be mere coincidence. These whispered conversations didn't immediately lead to action. The idea that Kulthum could be a serial killer seemed too absurd to take seriously, but seeds of suspicion were being planted. Additionally, Kulthum herself was becoming reckless. Her success had made her overconfident, and she was taking chances that a more careful criminal would have avoided. She was poisoning people in rapid succession, sometimes with minimal planning or preparation. She was making financial moves, life insurance policies, updated wills, power of attorney documents that were creating a documented trail of her involvement in her victims' lives. Most dangerously, she had begun to enjoy the killing too much, deriving pleasure from the suffering she caused in ways that were starting to show in her behavior. There were moments when the mask slipped, when people caught glimpses of something cold and cruel behind Kulthum's friendly exterior. A nurse who worked with one of her victims later recalled feeling uncomfortable with how Kulthum described the patient's symptoms, almost seeming pleased by the suffering. A family member remembered Kulthum smiling slightly while discussing a victim's decline in graphic detail. These were small moments, easily dismissed or forgotten at the time, but they represented the growing strain of maintaining her dual identity. The beginning of the end for Kulthum Akbari came from an unexpected source. A young emergency room doctor named Dr. Sarah Chun, who had treated 3 of Kulthum's victims over the course of 18 months. Dr. Chun was observant, analytical, and possessed of the kind of pattern recognition skills that make great physicians. When a 4th patient arrived in her emergency room with mysterious symptoms and Kulthum Akbari's name appeared once again in the patient's file as the primary caregiver, something clicked in Dr. Chen's mind. The patient was Kulthum's husband's aunt, Yasmin Akbari, a 64-year-old woman who had been healthy until recently, when she had suddenly developed severe neurological symptoms and organ failure. Dr. Chun reviewed Yasmin's file and then, acting on instinct, pulled the records for the previous patients who had been connected to Kulthum. What she saw alarmed her deeply. For different patients, different ages, different baseline health conditions, but all presenting with symptom patterns that suggested poisoning rather than natural illness. and all of them had Kulthum Akbari as their primary caregiver. Dr. Chun did something that would prove crucial. She ordered a comprehensive toxicology screen for Yasmin Akbari, one that went far beyond the standard panels and specifically tested for heavy metals, rat poisons, and other substances that wouldn't normally be included. The results came back within 48 hours, and they were damning. Yasmin's blood contained elevated levels of arsenic and thallium, both at concentrations that could only result from intentional poisoning. Dr. Chun immediately contacted the hospital's administration and then the police. She presented her findings about not just Yasmin, but the pattern she had observed across multiple patients. She provided documentation, test results, and a timeline that showed a correlation between Kulthum's caregiving and patient deterioration. She made the case that this wasn't coincidence or medical misfortune. This was serial murder being conducted under the guise of family caregiving. The police investigation that followed moved quickly once it began, largely because Dr. Chun had provided such strong initial evidence. Detectives obtained court orders to exhume several bodies of people who had died under Kulthum's care, subjecting them to forensic analysis that had never been performed when they died. The results were horrifying. Every single body tested showed evidence of poisoning. Some contained multiple toxins. The variety and concentration of poisons found in these victims remains painted a picture of systematic, repeated murder over many years. Simultaneously, investigators began interviewing family members, friends, and acquaintances of Kulthum's victims. They discovered a network of death that was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. People came forward with stories about loved ones who had died mysteriously after Kulthum became involved in their care. Financial investigators uncovered a web of insurance policies, changed wills, and suspicious transfers of money and property that all benefited Kulthum or her immediate family. The scope of her crimes was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested she had killed at least 12 people, with possibly several more victims whose deaths had been successfully disguised as natural causes. The arrest of Kulthum Akbari took place on September 15, 2012. Police arrived at her home early in the morning, armed with arrest warrants and search warrants. Kulthum was still in her nightgown, preparing breakfast for her family, when officers knocked on her door. According to the arresting officers, she showed no emotion when informed she was being arrested for multiple counts of first-degree murder. She didn't protest her innocence, didn't ask questions, didn't appear surprised or frightened. She simply nodded, asked if she could change clothes, and then calmly accompanied them to the police station. The search of Kulthum's home revealed a treasure trove of evidence that demonstrated both her guilt and the meticulousness of her planning. Hidden in her bedroom closet, investigators found a locked box containing detailed notes about her victims, their medical histories, the poisons she had used on each one, observations about symptoms and progression of their conditions. It was essentially a murder diary, documenting years of systematic killing with the clinical detachment of a scientist recording experimental data. In her kitchen pantry, carefully concealed behind legitimate cooking supplies, police discovered her collection of poisons. Bottles of antifreeze, containers of rat poison containing thallium and arsenic, prescription medications that had never been prescribed to anyone in her household, and various household chemicals that could be weaponized to cause internal damage. Each container was carefully labeled with notations only Kulthum would understand: victim initials, dosage amounts, dates of administration. She had turned her kitchen into a laboratory for death, transforming the heart of family life into a place where murder was prepared alongside dinner. The financial investigation revealed the scope of Kulthum's gains from her murder spree. Over the 7-year period of her known crimes, she and her immediate family had received more than $2 million through inheritances, life insurance payouts, and property transfers from her victims. She had systematically targeted the most vulnerable members of her extended family and social circle, eliminating them and profiting from their deaths with a ruthlessness that shocked even experienced homicide investigators. During interrogations, Kulthum maintained an eerie calmness that unsettled the detectives questioning her. She didn't confess, but she also didn't mount any vigorous defense. She answered questions in a monotone voice, showing no emotional response when confronted with evidence of her crimes. When shown photographs of her victims, she looked at them with what witnesses described as complete indifference. as though they were pictures of strangers rather than people she had systematically tortured and murdered. Psychologists who evaluated Cultham diagnosed her as having antisocial personality disorder with strong narcissistic and sadistic traits. She displayed a complete lack of empathy, an inability to form genuine emotional connections with other human beings, and a worldview in which other people existed solely as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated. The psychological profile painted a picture of someone fundamentally different from normal human beings. Someone who could smile while poisoning your food, who could comfort you in your dying moments knowing she was the cause of your suffering, who could attend your funeral and shed tears that meant absolutely nothing. The trial of Cultham Akbari began in March 2014, nearly 2 years after her arrest. The prosecution built a methodical case, presenting victim after victim, showing the pattern of caregiving followed by suspicious illness followed by death. They brought in toxicologists who explained how each poison worked, what suffering it caused, how it could be disguised as natural illness. They presented financial records showing Cultham's systematic enrichment through her victims' deaths. They called family members who testified about watching their loved ones suffer while Cultham played the devoted caregiver. The testimony from surviving family members was particularly devastating. They described the betrayal they felt, the horror of realizing that someone they had trusted and loved had been murdering their relatives. They talked about the weddings Cultham had attended, the family dinners she had hosted, the holiday celebrations where she had laughed and smiled while actively poisoning multiple people at the same table. The psychological damage to the Akbari family and the broader community was profound. Trust had been shattered in ways that could never be fully repaired. The defense attempted to argue that the deaths were coincidental, that Cultham had simply been an unlucky caregiver who happened to be present when multiple people died of natural causes. But the evidence was overwhelming. The exhumed bodies, the poisons found in her home, the financial trail, the detailed notes about her victims. All of it created a picture of guilt that was impossible to dispute. The defense's arguments crumbled under the weight of forensic evidence and expert testimony. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came from Cultham herself, in the form of statements she had made to a cellmate while awaiting trial. The cellmate testified that Cultham had bragged about her crimes, describing them in detail and expressing pride at having gotten away with murder for so long. She had called herself smart, too clever to be caught, and expressed frustration that one nosy doctor had ruined what she called her perfect system. These statements, combined with the physical evidence, destroyed any remaining doubt about her guilt. The prosecution presented evidence for 12 confirmed murders, though they acknowledged that the true number was likely higher. Some victims had been cremated, making forensic analysis impossible. Others had died so long ago that evidence had degraded beyond usefulness. But the 12 cases they could prove represented a killing spree that ranked among the most prolific in American history, making Cultham Akbari one of the deadliest female serial killers the country had ever seen. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 8 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 12 counts of first-degree murder, along with multiple counts of attempted murder, fraud, and abuse of a vulnerable person. When the verdicts were read, Cultham showed no reaction. She sat motionless in her chair, her face expressionless, as the judge formally recorded the guilty verdicts that would send her to prison for the rest of her life. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months later, and it provided an opportunity for victims' families to address Cultham directly and tell her about the devastation she had caused. One by one, they approached the microphone and spoke about the people she had murdered. They described loving parents, devoted siblings, kind neighbors, human beings with lives and dreams and people who loved them. They talked about the suffering Cultham had inflicted, the painful deaths she had orchestrated, the holes she had left in their families that could never be filled. Through all of these victim impact statements, Cultham sat unmoved. She looked at the families addressing her without any sign of remorse or regret. Some family members broke down while speaking, overcome by grief and anger, but Cultham's expression never changed. She was looking at them, but it was as though she was looking through them, as though their pain and suffering meant nothing to her because, in truth, it didn't. They were still just objects to her, inconveniences complaining about losses that seemed to her insignificant. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, Cultham declined. She had nothing to say, no apology to offer, no explanation to provide. Her silence spoke volumes about the emptiness at her core, the complete absence of human conscience or compassion that had allowed her to commit such horrific crimes without apparent internal conflict. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, spoke about the magnitude of Cultham's crimes and their impact on the community. He described her actions as representing a betrayal of the most fundamental human bonds, the trust between family members, between friends, between caregivers and those dependent on their care. He noted that she had transformed acts of kindness and caregiving into weapons of murder, corrupting something beautiful and necessary into something monstrous. Kulthum Ekbari was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 300 years for the attempted murders and fraud charges. The judge's final words to her were chilling in their simplicity. You will never again have the opportunity to hurt another human being. You will spend every remaining day of your life in prison. And when you die, you will be remembered only as a monster who destroyed innocent lives for money and satisfaction. Kulthum was transported to a maximum security women's prison, where she would spend the rest of her days in protective custody due to the nature of her crimes and the danger other inmates posed to her. Reports from prison officials indicate that she has been a model prisoner, following rules, keeping to herself, showing no behavioral problems. But that compliance is likely just another mask, another performance for an audience she needs to manipulate. The woman who poisoned 12 people to death is still the same person. She has simply been caged. The aftermath of Kulthum Ekbari's crimes continued to ripple through the community for years after her conviction. The Ekbari family fractured under the weight of betrayal and grief, with some members unable to maintain relationships with others because every family gathering became a reminder of the monster who had lived among them. Therapy and counseling became necessary for dozens of people whose lives had been touched by her evil, people struggling to process the reality that someone they had trusted had been capable of such systematic cruelty. Dr. Sarah Chun, the emergency room physician whose observation and persistence had finally stopped Kulthum's killing spree, became an advocate for improved protocols in identifying poisoning cases. She lectures at medical conferences about recognizing patterns that might indicate intentional poisoning, urging healthcare providers to consider the possibility that some mysterious illnesses might have criminal origins. Her work has potentially saved lives by alerting medical professionals to warning signs they might otherwise have missed. The case also prompted changes in how insurance companies and financial institutions handle situations where one person is the beneficiary in multiple life insurance policies or inheritances. New protocols were implemented to flag potential serial killers who use financial gain as their primary motive, creating systems that might have caught Kulthum earlier in her killing spree if they had existed then. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Kulthum Ekbari's crimes is the reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. It doesn't always look like the monsters in horror movies or the criminals on television. Sometimes evil wears a friendly smile, brings you homemade food, sits beside your hospital bed holding your hand. Sometimes evil is the person you trust most in the world, the one you would never suspect because they seem so normal, so caring, so devoted. Kulthum Ekbari destroyed at least 12 lives and damaged countless others. She killed for money, but also for the satisfaction of holding power over life and death. She tortured people physically and psychologically, deriving pleasure from suffering she deliberately inflicted. She betrayed every bond of human trust and decency, transforming relationships that should have been sources of love and support into opportunities for murder. Today, she remains imprisoned, a woman whose name has become synonymous with betrayal and heartless cruelty. She will die in prison, unmourned except perhaps by family members who still struggle to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the monster she actually was. Her story serves as a dark reminder that we are sometimes most vulnerable to those we trust most completely, and that the price of that vulnerability can be measured in lives destroyed and families shattered. The victims of Kulthum Ekbari, Muhammad, Nasir, Bibi, Rabia, Hamid, Shirley, Muhammad Rizvi, Aisha Rizvi, Jabir, Fatima, Maryam, and Yasmin, deserve to be remembered not as statistics in a serial killer's body count, but as individuals who had their lives stolen by someone they trusted. They suffered and died in confusion and pain, never understanding that the person supposedly caring for them was actually murdering them. Their memories stand as testimony to the depths of human cruelty and the importance of vigilance, even or especially, when dealing with those closest to us. The case of Kulthum Akbari closed with her conviction, but its echoes continue. Every family gathering where her name is whispered, every medical professional who pauses to consider whether mysterious symptoms might have a criminal cause, every person who looks twice at someone who seems too eager to help, these are all part of her dark legacy. She proved that monsters are real, that they walk among us wearing masks of normalcy, and that sometimes the greatest danger comes not from strangers but from those we invite into our homes and hearts. In the end, Kulthum Akbari's story is not just about murder and justice. It is about the fragility of trust, the importance of questioning even when it feels uncomfortable, and the recognition that evil can hide behind any face. She took 12 lives we know about, possibly more that remain undiscovered. She caused immeasurable suffering and left behind trauma that will echo through generations. And she did it all while maintaining the facade of a caring, devoted family member. Right up until the moment the walls finally closed in and the truth could no longer be hidden. Justice was served, but the scars remain. The families destroyed by her crimes continue to heal, knowing that the woman who caused their pain will never walk free again. And somewhere in a prison cell, Kulthum Akbari lives out her days, her legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the monsters who hide among us and the devastating consequences when trust is weaponized for evil. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3, The Angel of Death Wore Scrubs. The story of Orville Lynn Majors. Death doesn't knock, it worked the night shift. In one hospital, a healer became the hunter, and no one heard the screams. Tonight, we're walking into a place where people go to survive, only to meet the man who decided they wouldn't. This isn't about a monster lurking in shadows. This is about a monster dressed in hospital whites, trusted with lives, celebrated as a caregiver. Orville Lynn Majors didn't hide in darkness. He worked in fluorescent light, surrounded by colleagues, families, and patients who believed he was there to save them. But behind that calm exterior, behind those steady hands, was something else entirely. Something cold, something calculating, something that turned a sanctuary into a graveyard. The halls of Vermilion County Hospital in Clinton, Indiana, seemed ordinary enough. Beige walls, the smell of antiseptic, the steady beeping of monitors. But between 1993 and 1995, those halls became a hunting ground. Patients died at an alarming rate, and no one could understand why. The answer was standing right there, clipboard in hand, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, smiling at worried families. Orville Lynn Majors wasn't just a nurse. He was a predator in plain sight, and his weapon of choice was the very medicine meant to heal. This is the story of how one man turned compassion into cruelty, how a hospital became a house of horrors, and how the dead began to outnumber the living in ways no one could ignore. What drives someone to kill the vulnerable, the sick, the dying? What kind of mind finds satisfaction in watching life drain away under their control? We're about to find out, and I promise you, this is a nightmare you won't be able to look away from. Vermilion County Hospital was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. It sat in Clinton, Indiana, a town so unassuming you could drive through it without noticing. The hospital served a rural community, mostly elderly folks, people with chronic illnesses, farmers who'd worked their bodies to the bone. It was a place of last resorts, where people came when they were at their most fragile. And that's exactly where Orville Lynn Majors thrived. Majors wasn't the kind of man who stood out. Average height, unremarkable face, the kind of person you'd pass in a grocery store and forget immediately. But those who worked with him remembered something else. A coldness, a detachment, a way of looking at patients that didn't quite fit. He'd been hired in 1993, and almost immediately something shifted in the hospital. The death rate began to climb. Not slowly, not subtly, dramatically. Patients who should have recovered didn't. Patients who were stable crashed without warning. And Majors was always there, always nearby, always the last person to see them alive. At first, no one connected the dots. Death is expected in hospitals, especially in units that care for the elderly and critically ill. But this was different. The numbers didn't lie. In the 2 years before Majors started working at Vermilion County Hospital, the facility averaged around 30 deaths per year. Once he arrived, that number exploded. During his time there, over 100 patients died under suspicious circumstances. That's more than one death every week. And nearly every single one of those deaths occurred during Major's shifts. Nurses began to whisper. Families began to question. Why did their loved ones, who seemed stable just hours before, suddenly stop breathing? Why were there no clear explanations? Why did the same nurse always seem to be involved? But questioning a colleague, especially in a small-town hospital, wasn't easy. Majors was confident, even arrogant. He carried himself with an air of superiority, dismissing concerns, brushing off worries. He made it clear that he knew best, that he was in control, that anyone who doubted him simply didn't understand medicine the way he did. But some people couldn't ignore their instincts. One nurse, who'd worked at the hospital for years, noticed that patients seemed to deteriorate rapidly when Majors was on duty. She saw him entering rooms alone, lingering longer than necessary, always with a syringe, always with an excuse. She watched as he administered medications without proper documentation, as he hovered over dying patients with a look that wasn't concern. It was something else, something darker. She started keeping her own records, noting dates, times, names. She wasn't the only one. Majors had a pattern, and once you knew what to look for, it was impossible to miss. He targeted patients who were already sick, already weak, already expected to die, but not yet. He chose victims who wouldn't raise immediate suspicion, people whose deaths could be explained away as natural, as inevitable. He preferred the night shift, when fewer eyes were watching, when families had gone home, when the hospital was quiet and still. He used medications that were difficult to trace, substances that mimicked natural causes, potassium chloride, epinephrine, drugs that stopped hearts, collapsed lungs, shut down systems. And he was good at it, terrifyingly good. One patient, an elderly woman named Luella Hopkins, was recovering from pneumonia. Her family visited daily, and she was improving, talking, even joking with the staff. Then Majors worked a night shift. By morning, she was dead. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, but her family couldn't understand it. She'd been fine. She'd been getting better. Another patient, a man in his 70s with diabetes, was stable, his condition managed, his vitals strong. Majors administered an injection. Within hours, the man was in respiratory distress. He died before anyone could intervene. The stories piled up, one after another, a mountain of bodies that couldn't be ignored. Families were devastated, confused, angry. They demanded answers, but the hospital struggled to provide them. Autopsies were rarely performed. Most of the patients were elderly, and natural death was assumed. Medical records were incomplete, conveniently vague, and Majors kept working, kept killing, kept slipping through the cracks. But even the most careful predator leaves traces. Colleagues began comparing notes, realizing that their individual suspicions were part of a much larger, much more horrifying picture. The hospital's administration couldn't ignore the whispers anymore. In 1994, they quietly launched an internal investigation. They reviewed death records, analyzed shift patterns, interviewed staff. And every single thread led back to the same person, Orville Lynn Majors. The data was damning. Of the deaths that occurred at Vermilion County Hospital during Majors' employment, an overwhelming majority happened during his shifts. The statistical probability of this being coincidence was virtually zero. Patients who had been stable for days would crash within hours of Majors caring for them. Medications were missing from supply rooms, unaccounted for, their absence corresponding with suspicious deaths. Witnesses reported seeing Majors administer injections that weren't ordered, that weren't documented, that no one else knew about. The evidence was mounting, and it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Someone was murdering patients, and that someone was Orville Lynn Majors. But the hospital was in a bind. Accusing a nurse of serial murder without absolute proof was a legal nightmare. They needed more than suspicions, more than patterns, more than whispers. They needed hard evidence. So they did what institutions often do when faced with uncomfortable truths. They tried to make the problem go away. In March 1995, Majors was quietly suspended, then fired, officially for poor job performance and patient care concerns. No criminal charges were mentioned. No public statements were made. The hospital hoped that removing him would be enough, that the deaths would stop, that the nightmare would end. And for a while, it seemed to work. After Majors left, the death rate at Vermilion County Hospital plummeted, returning to normal levels almost immediately. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted, as if the building itself could breathe again. But the damage was done. Families had lost loved ones under horrifying circumstances. A community had been betrayed by someone they trusted. And dozens of victims would never get justice because proving murder after the fact, especially murder by a skilled medical professional, is almost impossible. Majors moved on, finding work at other facilities, carrying his secrets with him. He believed he'd gotten away with it, that he was untouchable, that his intelligence and training made him invisible. But the investigators weren't done. Not by a long shot. They were just getting started, and they were about to uncover a killing spree so calculated, so cold-blooded, that it would shock the entire nation. The question wasn't just what Majors had done, it was why. What drives a person who dedicates their life to healing to become an instrument of death? What kind of mind finds pleasure in watching vulnerable people suffer? What void inside a person is so deep, so consuming, that only the act of killing can fill it? Those questions haunted everyone who worked on the case. Everyone who looked into Orville Lynn Majors' eyes and saw nothing staring back. He wasn't a monster born in darkness. He was a monster born in a hospital, trained in medicine, trusted by society, given access to the most vulnerable people imaginable. And he used that access to become one of the most prolific serial killers in American healthcare history. This wasn't a crime of passion, of rage, of desperation. This was methodical, deliberate, sustained. This was evil in its purest form, dressed in scrubs, hiding behind a stethoscope, wearing the mask of a healer. The first chapter of Orville Lynn Majors' story is about the invisible killer, the one no one wanted to believe existed. But belief doesn't change reality. And the reality was that for 2 years, a predator walked the halls of Vermilion County Hospital, choosing victims, planning deaths, executing them with clinical precision. He wasn't hunting in alleys or forests. He was hunting in a place where people went for safety, for care, for hope. And that made him more terrifying than any monster lurking in shadows could ever be. By late 1995, the Indiana State Police had taken over the investigation. What started as a hospital's internal concern had morphed into a full-scale criminal probe, one of the most complex medical murder investigations in state history. The task was enormous, reviewing years of medical records, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, analyzing pharmaceutical logs, exhuming bodies, and trying to prove that deaths initially ruled natural were actually homicides. And at the center of it all was Orville Lynn Majors, living his life, working new jobs, acting as if nothing had happened. Detectives assigned to the case knew they were dealing with someone unusual. Most killers leave obvious evidence: blood, weapons, witnesses, signs of struggle. But medical murders are different. They're committed by people who understand how the body works, how drugs interact, how death can be disguised as illness. Majors had insider knowledge, professional training, and access to substances that could kill without leaving clear traces. He knew how to time his attacks, how to avoid suspicion, how to blend in. Catching him would require more than traditional detective work. It would require medical expertise, forensic analysis, and an understanding of the psychology of healthcare killers. The investigators started with the numbers. They pulled every death record from Vermilion County Hospital between 1993 and 1995, creating a massive database. Then they cross-referenced those deaths with staffing schedules, determining who was working when each patient died. The pattern was undeniable. When Orville Majors was on duty, the death rate skyrocketed. When he wasn't, it dropped to normal levels. The statistical analysis was so stark, so clear, that it left no room for doubt. Something about Major's presence correlated directly with patient deaths, and that correlation was far too strong to be coincidence. But correlation isn't causation, and statistics alone wouldn't convict anyone in a court of law. The investigators needed physical evidence, and that meant exhuming bodies. Between 1995 and 1997, the bodies of 6 patients who had died under suspicious circumstances during Major's shifts were exhumed and subjected to extensive toxicology testing. The results were chilling. Several of the victims had abnormally high levels of potassium chloride and epinephrine in their systems, substances that could cause cardiac arrest and respiratory failure, substances that would naturally degrade over time but still left detectable traces, substances that had no legitimate medical reason for being present in the concentrations found. Potassium chloride is particularly insidious. In controlled, small doses, it's a necessary electrolyte. But in large amounts, injected directly into the bloodstream, it causes the heart to stop almost immediately. It mimics a natural heart attack so closely that unless someone is specifically looking for it, it goes undetected. Epinephrine, commonly known as adrenaline, has legitimate medical uses in emergency situations, but in excessive doses, it causes the heart to race uncontrollably, leading to cardiac arrest. These weren't medications that patients would receive accidentally. These were deliberate, calculated injections designed to kill. The investigators also discovered irregularities in pharmaceutical records. Medications were missing from locked cabinets, unaccounted for in logs, their disappearance corresponding with the deaths of specific patients. Witnesses came forward, describing how Majors would enter medication storage areas alone, how he'd administer injections without consulting doctors, how he'd falsify records to cover his tracks. One nurse recalled seeing Majors draw up a syringe in a supply room and then walk directly to a patient's room. Minutes later, that patient was in cardiac arrest. Majors had been arrogant, even sloppy at times, because he believed he was smarter than everyone else. He thought his medical knowledge made him untouchable, that no one would dare question a licensed nurse, that the system would protect him. But the system was closing in, tightening around him like a noose. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every exhumed body brought investigators closer to building an airtight case. But Majors wasn't making it easy. He maintained his innocence, insisting that he was a dedicated healthcare professional being scapegoated for a hospital's failure to properly care for patients. He hired a lawyer, refused to cooperate with investigators, and portrayed himself as a victim of a witch hunt. He claimed that the hospital was looking for someone to blame for their high death rate, that the investigation was motivated by a desire to avoid lawsuits, that he was being targeted because he'd spoken out about substandard care. It was a clever defense, one designed to create reasonable doubt, to make a jury question whether a nurse could really be capable of such systematic, cold-blooded murder. The psychological profile investigators built on Majors was disturbing. He exhibited traits common among medical serial killers: a need for control, a fascination with death, a lack of empathy, and a desire to play God. Colleagues described him as arrogant and dismissive, someone who seemed to enjoy having power over vulnerable people. Some recalled that he expressed frustration with difficult patients, those who complained, those who required extra care, those who didn't follow his instructions. For Majors, these patients weren't human beings deserving of compassion. They were annoyances, obstacles, problems to be solved, and his solution was death. One particularly chilling detail emerged during the investigation. Witnesses reported that Majors seemed unusually calm, even pleased, after patients died, while other nurses would be shaken, upset, questioning what went wrong. Majors remained detached, unaffected. He'd fill out paperwork, inform families with clinical precision, and move on to the next task without hesitation. Some colleagues found this professionalism admirable at first, a sign of experience and composure under pressure. But in hindsight, it was something else entirely. It was the behavior of someone who felt no guilt, no remorse, no emotional connection to the lives he'd taken. The investigation also uncovered attempts by Majors to manipulate coworkers and deflect suspicion. When nurses started questioning the death rate, Majors would suggest alternative explanations, blaming the patient's pre-existing conditions, questioning the competence of other staff members, pointing out flaws in hospital protocols. He was skilled at redirecting attention, at creating doubt, at making others question their own instincts. It's a common tactic among predators, and Majors wielded it expertly. By 1997, investigators had enough evidence to move forward. On December 30th, 1997, Orville Lynn Majors was arrested and charged with 6 counts of murder. The charges represented only a fraction of the deaths investigators believed he was responsible for, but they were the cases where the evidence was strongest, where toxicology results were definitive, where witnesses were credible and consistent. Prosecutors knew they couldn't charge him with every suspicious death. Proving medical murder beyond a reasonable doubt is incredibly difficult, and they needed to focus on the cases they could win. Major's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. For people in Clinton, Indiana, the idea that a trusted nurse had been systematically murdering patients was almost incomprehensible. These were people who'd known Majors, who'd worked with him, who'd trusted him with their loved ones. The betrayal was profound, the horror overwhelming. Families who'd lost relatives during his time at the hospital were left with agonizing questions. Had their loved one been murdered? Had they died in pain, in fear, at the hands of someone who was supposed to help them? The legal battle that followed would be long and brutal. Major's defense team fought every piece of evidence, challenged every witness, questioned every toxicology report. They argued that the exhumations were flawed, that the statistical analysis was misleading, that the witnesses were unreliable. They painted Majors as a scapegoat, a man being punished for systemic failures he had nothing to do with. But the prosecution had a mountain of evidence, and they were prepared to bury Majors with it. As the trial approached, the full scope of Majors' killing spree became clearer. Investigators believed he was responsible for the deaths of at least 130 patients, possibly more. The exact number would never be known. Many of the victims had been cremated, their bodies lost to fire, their deaths impossible to investigate. But even the most conservative estimates placed Majors among the deadliest serial killers in American history, a body count that rivaled the most notorious murderers ever caught. The second chapter of Orville Lynn Majors' story is about the hunt, the painstaking work of detectives, forensic experts, and prosecutors who refused to let him get away with murder. It's about the evidence that slowly, methodically built a case against a man who thought he was untouchable. And it's about the moment when the mask finally slipped, when the healer was revealed as the killer, when the angel of death was dragged into the light. The trial of Orville Lynn Majors began in October 1999, more than 4 years after his last known victim died. The courtroom in Terre Haute, Indiana, was packed. Families of victims, journalists, medical professionals, and curious onlookers all crammed into every available seat. This wasn't just a murder trial, it was a reckoning. For the first time, a community would hear the full extent of Majors' crimes, the cold, calculated way he'd ended lives, and the arrogance with which he'd tried to evade justice. The prosecution's case was built on 3 pillars: statistical evidence, forensic toxicology, and witness testimony. Each pillar was meticulously constructed, designed to eliminate any reasonable doubt that Orville Lynn Majors was a serial killer who used his position as a nurse to murder vulnerable patients. The statistical evidence was presented first, and it was damning. Expert witnesses, including epidemiologists and data analysts, walked the jury through the death rates at Vermilion County Hospital before, during, and after Majors' employment. The numbers told a story that was impossible to ignore. Before Majors started working at the hospital, the facility averaged approximately 30 deaths per year. During his tenure from 1993 to 1995, that number exploded to over 100 deaths. After he was fired, the death rate immediately dropped back to normal levels. More significantly, over 90% of the suspicious deaths occurred during Majors' shifts. The probability of this being coincidence was calculated at less than 1 in a billion. But the defense attacked these numbers aggressively. They argued that statistical correlation wasn't proof of causation, that many factors could explain the increased death rate. An aging patient population, flu outbreaks, staffing shortages, deteriorating hospital conditions. They suggested that Majors was simply unlucky, that he happened to be working when naturally sicker patients were admitted. It was a strategy designed to create doubt, to make the jury question whether numbers alone could convict a man of murder. That's where the forensic evidence came in. The exhumed bodies provided physical proof that couldn't be explained away by statistics or bad luck. Toxicology reports showed abnormally high levels of potassium chloride and epinephrine in the tissues of 6 victims, concentrations that could only have resulted from direct injection, not natural bodily processes or medical treatment. Expert witnesses explained how these substances worked, how they caused death, and why their presence in such quantities was medically impossible under legitimate circumstances. One toxicologist testified that the level of potassium chloride found in one victim's tissue was consistent with a rapid, large-volume injection directly into the bloodstream, a method that would cause almost instantaneous cardiac arrest. Another expert explained that the epinephrine concentrations detected were far beyond any therapeutic dose, levels that would cause the heart to beat so violently and rapidly that it would effectively tear itself apart. These weren't accidents. These weren't medical errors. These were deliberate acts of murder, committed by someone with medical knowledge and access to controlled substances. The defense tried to challenge the forensic evidence, bringing in their own experts to question the reliability of testing decades-old remains, to suggest contamination or degradation of samples, to argue that the substances could have been introduced during the embalming process. But the prosecution's experts were prepared for these challenges, explaining the rigorous protocols followed during exhumation and testing, the multiple confirmatory tests conducted, and the impossibility of the detected substances being anything other than evidence of homicide. Then came the witnesses: nurses, doctors, hospital staff, and family members who testified about what they'd seen, what they'd suspected, and what they'd lost. Their testimony brought the statistics and toxicology reports to life, transforming numbers and chemical compounds into human stories of betrayal, suffering, and death. One nurse described walking into a patient's room to find Majors standing over an elderly woman, syringe in hand, the patient gasping for air. Majors had claimed he was administering prescribed medication, but when the nurse checked the chart, there was no such order. By the time doctors arrived, the patient was dead. Another nurse testified about finding Majors in the medication room, drawing up syringes without documentation, becoming defensive and angry when questioned. Multiple witnesses described Majors' cold, detached demeanor after patients died, his lack of emotion, his almost casual attitude toward death. Family members told heartbreaking stories of loved ones who were recovering, who seemed stable, who were expected to go home, until Majors worked a shift. One daughter testified about her mother, who'd been hospitalized for a minor infection. The woman was talking, eating, making plans for after her discharge. Then Majors cared for her overnight. By morning, she was dead, her death attributed to sudden cardiac arrest. The daughter had suspected something was wrong immediately, but her concerns were dismissed as grief and denial. Now, years later, she finally had answers, and those answers were horrifying. The defense's strategy was to attack the credibility of witnesses, to suggest that memories were unreliable, that people were reconstructing events with the benefit of hindsight, that they were seeing patterns that didn't exist because they wanted someone to blame. Majors' attorneys painted him as a dedicated nurse who'd worked in a poorly managed hospital, who'd been assigned the sickest patients, who'd become a convenient scapegoat when the facility needed to deflect responsibility for its failures. Majors himself took the stand, a risky move that the defense believed was necessary. He testified that he'd always acted in his patients' best interests, that every medication he'd administered was appropriate and necessary, that the deaths occurred because the patients were extremely ill. He portrayed himself as a compassionate caregiver who'd been devastated by each loss, who'd done everything possible to save his patients. He denied ever harming anyone, denied accessing medications improperly, denied the statistical evidence that overwhelmingly pointed to his guilt. But under cross-examination, Majors' composure cracked. Prosecutors pressed him on specific cases, on discrepancies in his testimony, on the impossibility of his explanations matching the forensic evidence. They confronted him with medical records showing medications administered without authorization, with witness statements contradicting his version of events, with the undeniable fact that patients died at an alarming rate only when he was working. Majors became defensive, evasive, at times openly hostile. The jury watched as the mask slipped, as the calm, professional nurse revealed something darker underneath. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful and emotional. They asked the jury to consider the totality of the evidence. The statistics that defied explanation, the forensic proof of deliberate poisoning, the witness testimony describing suspicious behavior, and Major's own inability to provide credible explanations. They reminded the jury that 6 families had lost loved ones under horrifying circumstances, that those victims had trusted Majors with their lives, and that he'd repaid that trust with murder. They argued that Majors wasn't a healer. He was a predator who'd exploited the most vulnerable people imaginable for his own twisted satisfaction. The defense's closing argument focused on reasonable doubt. They argued that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence, statistical analysis, and unreliable witnesses. They suggested that the forensic evidence was questionable, that the hospital had failed its patients and was now trying to blame one nurse, that Majors was being convicted based on suspicion rather than proof. They urged the jury to consider how difficult it was to definitively prove medical murder, and to err on the side of caution before convicting a man of such heinous crimes. The jury deliberated for 13 hours over 2 days. When they returned, they delivered guilty verdicts on all 6 counts of murder. The courtroom erupted. Families sobbed. Journalists rushed to file reports, and Orville Lynn Majors sat motionless, his face blank, showing no emotion. He'd been convicted, and he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The angel of death had finally been held accountable. During the sentencing phase, families were given the opportunity to address Majors directly. One by one, they stood and spoke about the people he'd killed: mothers, fathers, grandparents, beloved family members who trusted him and died because of that trust. They described the pain of losing loved ones under suspicious circumstances, the years of uncertainty before the investigation, and the horror of learning that those deaths had been deliberate murders. Majors listened without expression, never apologizing, never acknowledging his crimes, never showing even a flicker of remorse. The judge sentenced him to 360 years in prison, effectively multiple life sentences. Majors would never be free again. He would die behind bars, just as his victims had died under his care, alone, helpless, and at someone else's mercy. The trial was over, but the questions lingered. How had he gotten away with it for so long? Why hadn't anyone stopped him sooner? And most disturbingly, how many other victims would never be identified, never be accounted for, their deaths forever attributed to natural causes when the reality was murder? The conviction of Orville Lynn Majors didn't bring closure. It brought more questions, deeper horror, and a community left to grapple with the realization that they'd harbored one of America's most prolific serial killers. The trial had exposed the crimes, but understanding the man behind them, the psychology that drove him to kill, remained elusive and terrifying. In the years following his conviction, investigators and psychologists attempted to build a profile of Majors, to understand what transformed a licensed nurse into a serial murderer. The answers they found were chilling. Majors exhibited classic traits of what criminologists call angels of death, healthcare workers who kill patients under their care. These killers are often motivated by a desire for control, a god complex that comes from having power over life and death, and a lack of empathy that allows them to view patients as objects rather than human beings. Colleagues who worked with Majors described him as arrogant and condescending, someone who believed he was intellectually superior to those around him. He frequently criticized other nurses, questioned doctors' orders, and made it clear that he thought he knew better than everyone else. This grandiosity is common among medical serial killers. They see themselves as ultimate arbiters, capable of deciding who deserves to live and who should die. For Majors, each murder was an assertion of power, a demonstration of his control over the most fundamental aspect of existence. But there was another, darker element to his psychology. Some experts believe Majors experienced pleasure from killing, a sadistic satisfaction derived from watching vulnerable people suffer and die. Witnesses had described his unusual calmness after patients died, his lack of emotional response, his almost clinical detachment. This wasn't the behavior of someone traumatized by death. It was the behavior of someone who'd become comfortable with it, perhaps even addicted to it. Each successful murder reinforced his sense of invincibility, his belief that he was smarter than everyone else, that he could kill with impunity. Investigators also explored Major's background, looking for early warning signs, childhood traumas, or incidents that might explain his transformation into a killer. What they found was relatively unremarkable. Majors had grown up in a working-class family in Indiana, nothing in his early life obviously predicting the monster he would become. He'd pursued nursing, earned his license, and worked in various healthcare settings before arriving at Vermilion County Hospital. There were no documented incidents of violence, no criminal record, no overt red flags. He was, by all outward appearances, a normal person who'd chosen a caring profession. This ordinariness is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of Major's story. He wasn't a visibly disturbed individual, wasn't someone who displayed obvious warning signs. He functioned in society, held down jobs, interacted normally with colleagues and friends. The monster was hidden, revealed only in the private moments when he stood over helpless patients, syringe in hand, making the decision to end their lives. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself, that predators often wear the most trusted, respectable masks. The hospital itself faced intense scrutiny after Major's conviction. How had he been able to kill so many people without being stopped sooner? Why hadn't the dramatically increased death rate triggered immediate investigation? Why were concerns raised by nurses dismissed or ignored? The answers revealed systemic failures, a culture that prioritized institutional reputation over patient safety, and a reluctance to believe that a licensed healthcare professional could be a murderer. Several nurses testified that they'd reported their suspicions to supervisors, but those reports were either not taken seriously or not acted upon. There was a reluctance to accuse a colleague without absolute proof, a fear of litigation, and an institutional instinct to protect the hospital's image. By the time the administration finally took action, dozens of people were already dead. The tragedy was compounded by the knowledge that many victims could have been saved if the warning signs had been heeded earlier. In response to the Majors case, Indiana and other states implemented stricter oversight of healthcare facilities, improved protocols for investigating suspicious patient deaths, and created systems for reporting concerns about potentially dangerous medical professionals. Hospitals were required to track death rates more carefully, to investigate unusual patterns, and to create environments where staff could report suspicions without fear of retaliation. These changes came too late for Majors' victims, but they represented an attempt to prevent future tragedies. Majors himself never confessed. He maintained his innocence throughout his trial and continued to do so after his conviction. In prison, he filed multiple appeals, all of which were denied. He claimed he was a victim of a flawed investigation, of false testimony, of a rush to judgment. He never acknowledged his crimes, never expressed remorse, never provided closure to the families who'd lost loved ones. This lack of remorse is characteristic of psychopathic personalities, an inability or unwillingness to recognize the humanity of victims, to feel guilt or empathy, to accept responsibility for actions. The emotional toll on the families of Majors' victims was immense and lasting. Many struggled with guilt, wondering if they should have noticed something, if they should have asked more questions, if they could have saved their loved ones. Others were consumed by anger, frustrated that justice had come too late, that Majors had been allowed to kill for so long. Support groups formed, bringing together people connected by tragedy, trying to find ways to heal from trauma that seemed impossible to overcome. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the realization that many victims would never be identified. The 6 murders Majors was convicted of represented only a fraction of the deaths investigators believed he caused. Many potential victims had been cremated, their bodies destroyed, making forensic investigation impossible. Others had been buried long enough that tissue degradation eliminated the possibility of detecting injected substances. Conservative estimates placed Majors' victim count at around 130, but the actual number could be higher, much higher. Every patient who died under suspicious circumstances during his employment remained a question mark, a possible victim, a person whose death might have been murder rather than natural causes. The Majors case also highlighted the vulnerability of elderly and chronically ill patients in healthcare settings. These individuals are often unable to advocate for themselves, dependent on caregivers for basic needs, and assumed to be at high risk of death due to age and illness. This makes them ideal targets for medical serial killers. Their deaths are less likely to raise suspicion, less likely to trigger investigation, less likely to result in justice. It's a horrifying reality that the people most in need of protection are often the most vulnerable to abuse and murder. In 2017, Orville Lynn Majors died in prison at the age of 56. He'd served less than 20 years of his 360-year sentence, dying of natural causes, an irony not lost on the families of his victims. His death brought a measure of closure, the knowledge that he could never kill again, that he'd spent his final years behind bars. But it also brought frustration, because he died without ever admitting his crimes, without ever explaining why he'd done what he'd done, without ever giving his victims' families the answers they deserved. The legacy of Orville Lynn Majors is one of horror, betrayal, and systemic failure. He was a predator hiding in plain sight, a killer who used his medical training to murder the most vulnerable members of society. His story is a reminder that evil can exist anywhere, that trust can be weaponized, and that vigilance is necessary even in places we consider safe. It's a cautionary tale about the importance of listening to concerns, investigating suspicions, and never assuming that credentials or professional status make someone incapable of terrible crimes. The victims of Orville Lynn Majors deserve to be remembered not just as statistics, not just as case numbers, but as individuals who trusted a system that failed them. They were mothers and fathers, grandparents and friends, people who'd lived full lives and deserved to end those lives with dignity and peace. Instead, they encountered a monster dressed as a healer, and they paid the ultimate price. As we close this chapter, as we step away from the darkness of the story, we're left with unsettling truths. Monsters are real. They walk among us, work beside us, and wear the uniforms of protectors. They exploit our trust, prey on our vulnerability, and hide behind the very institutions designed to keep us safe. Orville Lynn Majors proved that the scariest predators aren't the ones lurking in shadows. They're the ones standing in fluorescent light, clipboard in hand, asking if you need anything before they quietly end your life. The investigation into Majors fundamentally changed how medical facilities approach suspicious deaths. Training programs now include modules on recognizing patterns of harm, on understanding the psychology of healthcare serial killers, on creating cultures where staff feel empowered to report concerns without fear. Hospitals implement peer review systems, medication tracking technologies, and statistical monitoring that flags unusual death rates before they spiral out of control. These measures exist because of Majors, because his crimes exposed vulnerabilities in a system that assumed healthcare workers couldn't be killers. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Majors case is about the nature of trust itself. We place enormous faith in medical professionals, surrendering our bodies and lives to their care when we're at our most helpless. That trust is sacred, necessary for a functioning healthcare system, and the vast majority of nurses, doctors, and caregivers honor it with integrity and compassion. But Majors weaponized that trust, turned it into a hunting tool, used it to access victims who couldn't defend themselves. His betrayal wasn't just of individuals, it was of the entire social contract that binds patients and caregivers. Families of victims continue to grapple with psychological scars that may never fully heal. Some describe a persistent anxiety about medical care, a lingering suspicion when loved ones are hospitalized, a fear that they can't fully shake even in the presence of caring, legitimate healthcare professionals. This is part of Major's lasting damage, the way his crimes poisoned trust, created doubt, and left people questioning whether they can ever feel safe in a hospital again. It's a form of secondary victimization, where the trauma extends beyond those directly harmed to entire communities that must now live with fear and suspicion. The psychological community has studied cases like Major's extensively, trying to develop better screening methods for identifying potential healthcare killers before they harm patients. But the reality is sobering. These individuals are often highly functional, pass background checks, perform well in training, and show no obvious signs of violent tendencies. They're skilled at compartmentalizing, at maintaining normal social facades while harboring dark compulsions. Early detection is extraordinarily difficult, which makes systemic safeguards, monitoring death rates, tracking medication use, encouraging staff to report concerns, even more critical. Some experts have noted that healthcare serial killers often escalate over time, starting with patients who are elderly or terminally ill, then gradually expanding their victim pool as they gain confidence and experience a growing compulsion to kill. Majors appears to have followed this pattern. His early victims were patients whose deaths could easily be explained as natural, whose families wouldn't question the outcome. As he continued without consequences, his boldness increased. He began taking greater risks, killing patients who were less obviously at death's door, administering lethal injections in circumstances where discovery was more likely. This escalation is common among serial killers. The initial thrill diminishes, requiring more frequent or brazen acts to achieve the same psychological satisfaction. There's also evidence suggesting that Majors derived a sense of power not just from killing, but from the knowledge that he was getting away with it. He worked alongside colleagues who suspected something was wrong but couldn't prove it. He looked families in the eye and offered condolences for deaths he'd caused. He navigated investigations, first internal and then criminal, maintaining his innocence with absolute confidence. For someone with narcissistic and sociopathic traits, this ability to deceive, to operate freely while suspected, likely provided its own dark gratification. The question of why Majors targeted specific patients remains partially unanswered. Some victims were described as difficult, demanding, uncooperative, critical of care. This has led some profilers to suggest that Majors killed partly out of irritation, eliminating patients he found annoying or challenging. Other victims were simply convenient, alone at night, vulnerable, easy targets. And some may have been selected for no reason other than that Majors felt the urge to kill and they were there. The randomness or near randomness of victim selection is particularly terrifying because it means that nearly any patient under his care could have become a target. In prison, Majors was largely isolated, housed in facilities for high-security inmates. Reports from corrections officers described him as withdrawn, uncommunicative, spending most of his time alone. He maintained a handful of correspondences, mostly with people who believed in his innocence or were fascinated by his case. He never granted interviews to journalists or researchers, never participated in psychological studies, never provided any insight into his motivations or mindset. This silence was deliberate, a final assertion of control. He would not give his victims' families the satisfaction of understanding, would not provide society with answers that might prevent future tragedies. Even in defeat, confined and powerless, he found a way to inflict one last cruelty. The death of Orville Lynn Majors in 2017 closed the criminal case but didn't end the story. Families continue to seek acknowledgement of additional victims, pushing for further investigation into deaths that occurred during Majors' tenure at Vermilion County Hospital and other facilities where he worked. Some have filed civil suits against the hospital, arguing that negligence and failure to act on warning signs contributed to their loved ones' deaths. These legal battles continue, each one a fight for recognition, for justice, for the acknowledgement that more people died than the 6 murders for which Majors was convicted. There's something profoundly disturbing about knowing that a killer's true victim count will never be established with certainty. Families live with the possibility, the probability, that their loved one was murdered, but without the definitive proof that would provide closure. They exist in a liminal space of suspicion and grief, unable to fully mourn because the truth remains ambiguous. This uncertainty is its own form of torture, and it's a direct result of systemic failures that allowed Majors to operate for so long. The Majors case also raises uncomfortable questions about institutional accountability. The hospital knew something was wrong. Staff members reported concerns. The death rate was undeniably, statistically impossible to explain through natural causes alone. Yet action was delayed, investigation was hesitant, and when Majors was finally removed, it was quietly, without public acknowledgement of the horror that had unfolded. The institution's priority seemed to be protecting itself from liability rather than protecting patients from a killer. This institutional self-preservation, this instinct to hide rather than confront, enabled Majors to continue killing and potentially allowed him to move on to other facilities where he could have harmed even more people. In the aftermath of the trial, several healthcare workers who'd worked with Majors spoke about the guilt they carried. They'd suspected something, seen things that didn't add up, felt instinctive unease around him, but they hadn't acted forcefully enough, hadn't pushed hard enough, hadn't trusted their own instincts. This guilt, while perhaps not entirely rational, speaks to the difficulty of accusing a colleague of murder. The social and professional costs of being wrong are enormous. The fear of appearing paranoid, of damaging someone's career without cause, of not being believed, these fears can silence suspicions until it's too late. Creating environments where these concerns can be raised and investigated without stigma is essential to preventing future cases. Looking at the broader landscape of healthcare serial killers, Majors is far from unique. Janine Jones, a pediatric nurse, is believed to have killed up to 60 infants and children. Charles Cullen, another nurse, confessed to murdering at least 40 patients. Harold Shipman, a British doctor, may have killed over 200 patients. These cases share common patterns: vulnerable victims, exploited trust, institutional failures, and terrifyingly high body counts. They reveal systematic vulnerabilities in healthcare systems worldwide, vulnerabilities that persist despite reforms and increased vigilance. What makes healthcare serial killers particularly dangerous is the combination of access, knowledge, and trust. They don't need to break into homes or lure victims to isolated locations. Victims come to them already weakened, already in need, already trusting. They have legitimate access to lethal substances and the knowledge to use them effectively, and their crimes are easily disguised as natural deaths, medical complications, or the inevitable decline of sick patients. It's the perfect storm of opportunity and cover, requiring only a person willing to exploit it. The story of Orville Lynn Majors is one that should haunt us, not because it's unique, but because it's not. It's a reminder that vigilance must be constant, that systems must be designed with skepticism and oversight, that the trustworthiness of individuals cannot be assumed based on credentials alone. It's a call to listen when something feels wrong, to investigate when patterns emerge, to prioritize patient safety over institutional reputation. As we reach the end of this nightmare, we're left with the faces of the victims: the elderly woman who was recovering from pneumonia, the diabetic man whose vitals were stable, the dozens of others whose names we know, and the many more whose names we don't. They trusted a system that failed them. They placed their lives in the hands of someone who saw them not as people but as opportunities. They died alone, confused, helpless, never knowing that the person supposed to save them was the one killing them. Orville Lynn Majors worked in a place of healing and turned it into a slaughterhouse. He wore the uniform of a caregiver and became an executioner. He smiled at families while their loved ones died by his hand. And for 2 years he walked free, unchallenged, uncaught, adding to a body count that may never be fully known. His conviction brought a measure of justice, but it couldn't reverse the damage, couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't erase the betrayal. The monster is gone now, died in a prison cell, never admitting what he'd done, never showing remorse, never giving his victims the dignity of truth. But his legacy remains in the policies that changed because of him, in the families that will never fully heal, in the reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence and chaos. Sometimes it arrives quietly, professionally, wearing scrubs and carrying a syringe. Sometimes it works the night shift. Sometimes it stands beside your hospital bed and asks if you need anything. And that's the truly terrifying part, knowing that monsters don't just exist in stories, in distant places, in the past. They exist in hospitals, in nursing homes, in places we're taught to consider safe. They exist because human beings are capable of profound darkness, because systems are imperfect, because trust can be weaponized. Orville Lynn Majors proved that the deadliest predators aren't the ones we fear. They're the ones we never suspect until it's too late. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now let's get into our final story. Story 4. This is the story of Beverly Gale Alit. The angel of death wore a nurse's uniform. She smiled as the babies stopped breathing. For minutes was all it took to become a killer, and she had 13 chances to perfect it. The children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital was supposed to be a sanctuary of healing. Instead, it became a hunting ground where the predator wore scrubs and carried syringes filled with poison. Tonight, we're tracking a monster who didn't lurk in shadows. She walked openly through fluorescent-lit corridors, her hands gentle on fevered foreheads, her voice a lullaby in the darkness. But those same hands were instruments of murder, and that lullaby was the last sound some children would ever hear. This is the story of Beverly Alit, the nurse who turned medicine into murder, who transformed a place of hope into a chamber of horrors, and who proved that the most terrifying monsters are the ones we invite into our most vulnerable moments. The spring of 1991 arrived in Lincolnshire with the promise of renewal, but within the walls of Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, something dark was taking root. Ward 4, the children's unit, had always been a place of controlled chaos. Crying infants, worried parents, exhausted staff working double shifts to keep the underfunded National Health Service running. Nobody noticed when the chaos began to take on a different quality, when the routine emergencies became something else entirely, something sinister that defied medical explanation. Beverly Gale Alit had joined the ward as a state-enrolled nurse in February 1991. At 23 years old, she carried herself with an eager-to-please demeanor that her colleagues initially found endearing, if sometimes overwhelming. She was the nurse who volunteered for extra shifts, who stayed late to comfort distressed children, who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to be present whenever a crisis erupted. Her uniform was always pristine, her brown hair neatly styled, her smile quick and reassuring. Parents trusted her instinctively. After all, what could be more wholesome than a young woman dedicating her life to the care of sick children? But there were things about Beverly Alit that didn't quite fit the picture of the devoted nurse. Her training had been troubled, marked by an excessive number of sick days, so many that her tutors had questioned whether she should qualify at all. She complained constantly of mysterious ailments, underwent unnecessary medical procedures, and seemed to crave the attention that came with being a patient almost as much as she enjoyed being a caregiver. This pattern had a name: Munchausen syndrome, a psychological disorder where individuals fabricate or induce illness in themselves to gain sympathy and attention. But Beverly's sickness was about to metastasize into something far more malignant: Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where the victim isn't oneself but others, usually the vulnerable and defenseless. The first victim was 7-week-old Liam Taylor, admitted to Ward 4 on February 21, 1991, with a chest infection. It was a routine admission, the kind that happened dozens of times every month. Liam's parents had no reason for concern beyond the normal worry that accompanies any infant hospitalization. The medical staff anticipated a straightforward treatment plan followed by discharge within days. But Beverly Alit had been assigned to Liam's care, and nothing would be routine anymore. That evening, as twilight settled over the hospital grounds, Liam suddenly stopped breathing. His tiny body went rigid, his lips turned blue, and monitoring equipment erupted in a cacophony of alarms that sent nurses running from all directions. Beverly was already there, of course, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she initiated resuscitation procedures. The infant was saved, pulled back from the edge of death by the same hands that had pushed him toward it. Everyone praised Beverly's quick response, her vigilance, her dedication. Nobody suspected that she had been the architect of the crisis she had so heroically resolved. But Liam's ordeal wasn't over. 3 days later, on February 24th, he suffered another catastrophic collapse. This time, Beverly's intervention couldn't save him. The 7-week-old baby died, his small body surrendering to forces that the medical team couldn't understand. The post-mortem examination revealed nothing conclusive, no infection severe enough to explain his death, no congenital defect that might account for his sudden deterioration. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, a vague classification that masked the horror of what had actually occurred. Liam Taylor had been murdered, injected with massive doses of insulin that sent his blood sugar plummeting, and triggered a cascade of physiological chaos that his infant body couldn't withstand. The hospital mourned. Liam's parents were destroyed by grief, questioning what they might have done differently, wondering if they'd noticed symptoms earlier or chosen a different hospital. The nursing staff comforted each other, reminded themselves that they'd done everything possible, that sometimes despite medical science's best efforts, tragedy still occurred. Only one person knew the truth, and she returned to work the next day, ready to do it again. 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick was admitted to Ward 4 on March 5, 1991, suffering from epileptic seizures. He was a cheerful boy despite his condition, known for his infectious laugh and his love of football. His parents had been managing his epilepsy for years and knew the routine of hospital admissions, medication adjustments, and observation periods. They trusted the medical system implicitly. That trust would be weaponized against their son. Beverly once again positioned herself as Timothy's primary caregiver, her attentiveness remarked upon by his grateful parents. On March 10th, after showing signs of improvement and with discharge planned for the following day, Timothy went into cardiac arrest. The sudden collapse was shocking. Epileptic patients didn't typically experience heart failure, especially not young, otherwise healthy children whose condition had been stable. But the resuscitation team responded quickly, and Timothy's heart was restarted. He was transferred to a larger hospital in Nottingham for specialized care, his parents riding in the ambulance beside their unconscious son, praying for a recovery that would never come. Timothy Hardwick died 2 days later, his brain too damaged by oxygen deprivation to sustain life. The autopsy revealed elevated levels of lignocaine, a heart medication, in Timothy's system, levels so high they could only have been administered externally, injected by someone with access to the locked drug cabinet on Ward 4. But the investigation was cursory, the finding noted but not pursued with the vigor it deserved. The National Health Service was understaffed, overwhelmed, and operating under constant financial pressure. Thoroughly investigating every unexplained death would require resources the hospital simply didn't have. So Timothy's death was filed away, another tragic loss in a pediatric ward that was beginning to accumulate far too many tragedies. 1-year-old Kaylee Desmond arrived at the hospital on March 10, 1991, suffering from a chest infection. She was a beautiful child with bright eyes and an engaging smile, the kind of baby that nurses naturally gravitated toward. Her parents, working class and trusting, were relieved to have their daughter in professional care, confident that modern medicine would quickly resolve her respiratory issues. They couldn't have known they were delivering their child into the hands of a serial killer whose appetite for death was accelerating. The pattern repeated itself with horrifying precision. Initial treatment proceeded normally, Kaylee's condition appeared to stabilize, and then without warning, she suffered a cardiac arrest that sent her tiny body into convulsions. Beverly, alert, ever present, ever vigilant, managed the resuscitation, and Kaylee survived. But her hospital stay was extended, giving Beverly more opportunities to strike. Over the following days, Kaylee experienced multiple unexplained collapses, each one pushing her closer to death, each one resolved by the intervention of the nurse who was causing them. The medical team was baffled. Chest infections simply didn't cause this pattern of cardiac events in otherwise healthy infants. Finally, Kaylee was transferred to a specialized hospital in Nottingham, removed from Beverly's reach before the nurse could finish what she'd started. The child would survive, but she would bear the scars of her ordeal for the rest of her life. Brain damage from oxygen deprivation, developmental delays, and the invisible trauma of having been used as a plaything by a predator in human form. Her parents would spend years seeking answers, trying to understand what had gone wrong during that nightmare hospital stay, never suspecting that their daughter's suffering had been deliberately inflicted for no reason beyond the twisted psychological gratification of a woman who craved attention and power over life and death. 5-month-old Paul Crampton was admitted on March 20th, 1991, with a chest infection, and the deadly cycle continued. Beverly was assigned to his care, and within hours, Paul experienced a sudden, inexplicable collapse. His recovery was followed by another collapse, then another. Each crisis brought the medical team running, brought worried consultations and revised treatment plans, brought the attention and drama that Beverly thrived on. Paul was eventually transferred away from Grantham, removed from the killing field before Beverly could claim another life. But like Kaylee, he would carry permanent brain damage from the attacks he'd endured. The hospital was beginning to whisper. Something was wrong on Ward 4, something that defied statistical probability and medical explanation. Children were collapsing at rates that exceeded any reasonable baseline, experiencing complications that didn't match their diagnoses, requiring interventions that should never have been necessary. But the whispers remained just that, whispers, quiet concerns shared in break rooms but never escalated to formal inquiries, suspicions that were dismissed as pattern-seeking in random tragedy. The human mind resists accepting the truly horrific, prefers to believe in coincidence rather than conspiracy, in bad luck rather than deliberate malevolence. That resistance would cost more children their lives. 5-week-old Bradley Gibson was admitted on March 21, 1991, and immediately became Beverly's next target. The infant suffered multiple cardiac arrests during his stay, each one more severe than the last, each one leaving him more damaged. He too was eventually transferred away from Grantham, surviving but bearing the permanent neurological scars of Beverly's attacks. His parents would spend the rest of their lives caring for a severely disabled child, never fully understanding why their son's routine hospital admission had transformed him from a healthy infant into a person who would require constant care for the remainder of his life. The ward was hemorrhaging patients to unexpected complications, and still nobody stopped Beverly a lit. She continued to work, continued to volunteer for shifts, continued to position herself at the center of every medical emergency that erupted on Ward 4. And the emergencies kept coming, one after another, a relentless drumbeat of crisis that should have been impossible in a small children's unit but which had become the new, horrifying normal. April 1991 brought warmer weather to Lincolnshire, but no relief to Ward 4. If anything, the carnage was intensifying, Beverly's need for attention and control driving her to take greater risks, to strike more frequently, to push her victims closer to death with each attack. She had become addicted to the adrenaline rush that accompanied each emergency, the feeling of power that came from holding a child's life in her hands, deciding with calculated precision whether that child would live or die. The hospital staff had begun to notice her peculiar pattern of always being present during crises, but they interpreted it as dedication rather than causation, praised her quick responses rather than questioning her suspicious proximity to every catastrophe. Yik Hung Chan, known affectionately as Henry, was 2 years old when his parents brought him to Grantham Hospital on April 1, 1991. The toddler had been suffering from a minor ailment, nothing that should have required more than routine observation and basic treatment. His parents, immigrants who had worked hard to build a life in England, trusted the British healthcare system completely. They left their son in the hands of professionals, confident he would receive excellent care. Instead, they delivered him to a predator who saw him as nothing more than an opportunity for another injection, another crisis, another chance to play God. Beverly was assigned to Henry's care with the same manufactured enthusiasm she brought to every patient interaction. To the casual observer, she seemed genuinely fond of the child, spending extra time at his bedside, speaking to him in gentle tones despite the language barrier between them. But her attentiveness had nothing to do with compassion and everything to do with opportunity. She was waiting for the right moment, the window when supervision was minimal and she could access the drug cabinet without observation. That moment came in the early hours of April 3rd. The night shift was understaffed, as usual, with nurses stretched thin across the ward. Beverly moved through the dimly lit corridors with the confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to handle medications and administer injections. She prepared a syringe of insulin, the clear liquid that would become her weapon of choice, the pharmaceutical tool that could induce catastrophic hypoglycemia while leaving minimal forensic evidence. Then she approached Henry's crib, where the 2-year-old slept peacefully, unaware that he had only minutes left to live. The injection took seconds. Henry stirred slightly, perhaps registering the pinch of the needle, but didn't wake fully. Beverly disposed of the syringe and returned to her other duties, waiting for the insulin to take effect, anticipating the alarms that would soon summon the resuscitation team. She didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, Henry's body began to react to the catastrophic drop in blood sugar. His breathing became labored, his small form began to convulse, and the monitoring equipment erupted in warnings that brought nurses running from all directions. Beverly was there first, of course, already beginning resuscitation procedures by the time her colleagues arrived. But this time, her heroic efforts failed. Henry Chan died in the early hours of April 3, 1991, his body unable to withstand the massive insulin overdose that had been deliberately administered by the nurse sworn to protect him. His parents were summoned to the hospital to find their son dead, their grief compounded by confusion. How could a child admitted with such a minor complaint have died so suddenly, so unexpectedly? The post-mortem examination should have immediately identified the cause of death. Henry's insulin levels were astronomically high, far beyond what his body could naturally produce, clear evidence of external administration. But the initial autopsy was incomplete, the finding noted but not immediately recognized for what it represented: proof of murder. The hospital administration received the report but didn't act decisively, didn't immediately suspend staff or launch a comprehensive investigation. The machinery of institutional bureaucracy moved slowly, grinding through protocols and procedures while Beverly Alit remained free to continue her killing spree. Just 4 days after Henry's murder, on April 7, 1991, 11-week-old Becky Phillips was admitted to Ward 4 with a simple cold, the kind of minor respiratory infection that millions of infants experience without serious complications. Her parents were young and anxious, concerned about their first child's health but reassured by the medical professionals who promised routine care and quick recovery. They couldn't have imagined that bringing their daughter to the hospital would result in anything other than standard treatment. They were wrong. Beverly immediately attached herself to Becky's care, displaying the same excessive attentiveness that had characterized her approach to previous victims. She volunteered to handle feedings, checked on the infant constantly, and positioned herself as the primary point of contact for Becky's parents. The young couple, grateful for what they perceived as exceptional nursing care, trusted Beverly completely, never suspecting that their daughter's caregiver was planning her murder. On April 9th, Becky suffered her first unexplained collapse. Her tiny body went rigid, her breathing stopped, and emergency alarms brought the resuscitation team sprinting to her bedside. Beverly, already present, helped revive the infant, her actions quick and professional, earning praise from colleagues and tearful gratitude from Becky's terrified parents. The medical team searched for explanations. Had they missed something in their initial assessment? Was there an underlying condition they hadn't detected? Nobody considered that the collapse had been deliberately induced by the nurse who had so efficiently responded to it. But Beverly wasn't finished with Becky Phillips. 2 days later, on April 11th, the infant suffered another catastrophic collapse, this one more severe than the first. Again, Beverly was present. Again, she initiated resuscitation, and again Becky was pulled back from death's edge. The pattern should have been obvious, the same nurse present for every emergency, the collapses occurring only when that particular nurse was on duty. But pattern recognition requires someone willing to ask uncomfortable questions, someone willing to consider that a trusted colleague might be a murderer. Nobody wanted to ask those questions yet. Becky's ordeal continued throughout her hospital stay, a series of mysterious collapses interspersed with brief periods of stability, each crisis leaving her more damaged, each recovery more incomplete. Her parents maintained a bedside vigil, watching helplessly as their daughter suffered through inexplicable medical emergencies that no doctor could adequately explain. They held her when she was conscious, prayed over her when she wasn't, and trusted that the medical team was doing everything possible to save her life. They never knew that the greatest threat to their daughter wore a nurse's uniform and carried a syringe filled with poison. Finally, mercifully, Becky was transferred to a specialized hospital away from Grantham, removed from Beverly's reach before the nurse could finish what she'd started. The infant would survive, but like so many of Beverly's other victims, she would bear permanent neurological damage from the repeated episodes of oxygen deprivation that Beverly had inflicted. Her childhood would be marked by developmental delays, by therapies and interventions, by the invisible scars of having been someone's victim before she was old enough to form memories. 4-year-old Katie Phillips, Becky's twin sister, had been admitted alongside her sister for observation, a precautionary measure given Becky's mysterious collapses. The decision to hospitalize Katie would prove catastrophic. Beverly saw the healthy 4-year-old as simply another opportunity, another victim to add to her growing collection, another chance to create the medical drama she craved. On April 19th, while Katie's parents were focused on Becky's condition, Beverly struck again, administering a massive dose of insulin to the previously healthy child. Katie's collapse was sudden and severe, her small body convulsing as her blood sugar plummeted to life-threatening levels. The resuscitation team responded immediately, working frantically to stabilize the child while her parents watched in horror, unable to comprehend how both their daughters could be suffering from such mysterious, catastrophic illnesses. Katie survived, but like her sister, she would carry permanent brain damage from Beverly's attack, neurological deficits that would affect her for the rest of her life. The Phillips family had been devastated twice over, both their children permanently damaged by a nurse whose psychological compulsions had transformed a place of healing into a killing field. Their lives would never return to normal, their futures forever altered by the actions of a woman they had trusted implicitly, a woman who had smiled at their daughters while planning their deaths. 5-year-old Bradley Gibson, not to be confused with the earlier Bradley, was readmitted to Ward 4 on April 20th, 1991, for follow-up treatment. He had been one of Beverly's earlier victims, surviving her initial attacks but left with permanent disabilities. His return to the ward gave Beverly another chance to strike, and she took it without hesitation. Bradley suffered another series of mysterious collapses during his readmission, each one pushing him closer to death, each one leaving him more damaged. His mother, already devastated by her son's earlier mysterious deterioration, watched helplessly as he suffered through yet another inexplicable medical crisis, never suspecting that his suffering was deliberate, that his trusted caregiver was actually his attacker. The hospital administration was beginning to panic, though they kept their concerns carefully contained within administrative meetings and confidential consultations. The statistical anomaly of Ward 4's mortality and morbidity rates could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck. Too many children were collapsing, too many were suffering unexplained cardiac arrests, too many were dying or sustaining permanent brain damage from causes that defied medical explanation. Something was terribly wrong, but identifying what required acknowledging a possibility so horrifying that nobody wanted to voice it. One of their own staff might be deliberately harming patients. The whispers that had begun in March had become urgent conversations by late April. Nurses compared notes, doctors reviewed case files, administrators examined duty rosters looking for patterns. And the pattern was undeniable. Beverly Elliott was present for every single unexplained collapse, every mysterious cardiac arrest, every catastrophic complication that defied medical logic. She was always there, always first to respond, always the nurse whose quick intervention saved the children she had secretly attacked. But institutional inertia is powerful, especially in an organization as large and bureaucratic as the National Health Service. Suspecting a nurse of murder is one thing. Proving it, acting on it, and accepting responsibility for having employed a serial killer is something else entirely. The hospital's response was cautious, measured, and ultimately inadequate to stop what was happening on Ward 4. The last weeks of Beverly Elliott's killing spree unfolded with a terrible momentum, as if the nurse's psychological needs had reached a fever pitch that demanded more frequent attacks, more dramatic crises, more deaths. She had become careless, her attacks more obvious, her presence at every emergency increasingly suspicious. But she seemed unable to stop herself, driven by compulsions that overrode any concern for self-preservation. The monster was fully unleashed, and Ward 4 had become her personal slaughterhouse. 15-month-old Claire Peck arrived at Grantham Hospital on April 22, 1991, suffering from an asthma attack. She was a beautiful toddler with blonde curls and bright blue eyes, the kind of child who could light up a room with her smile. Her parents were experienced with managing her asthma and had brought her to the hospital as a precaution, expecting routine treatment followed by discharge once her breathing stabilized. They had no way of knowing they were delivering their daughter to a nurse who had already killed multiple children and who would see Claire as nothing more than her next victim. Beverly was assigned to Claire's care, and she approached the toddler with her characteristic excessive attention, fussing over the child, speaking to her in sweet tones, gaining the complete trust of Claire's parents. Over the next few days, Claire's condition appeared to improve, her breathing becoming easier, her oxygen saturation levels rising. Discharge was being discussed, preparations were being made to send the toddler home to continue her recovery in the comfort of familiar surroundings. But Beverly couldn't allow that. On April 22nd, while Claire's parents had stepped away briefly, Beverly struck with calculated malice. She administered what would become a lethal dose of medication, the specifics of which would later be debated but which had the desired effect. Claire Peck went into sudden, catastrophic cardiac arrest. The monitoring equipment screamed warnings, bringing the medical team running. But this time, despite their best efforts, despite the immediate response and aggressive resuscitation attempts, Claire could not be saved. The 15-month-old died on April 22, 1991, her small body surrendering to the poison that Beverly had administered. Claire's parents were destroyed, unable to comprehend how their daughter could have been improving one moment and dead the next. The medical explanations offered to them made no sense, provided no comfort, answered none of their questions. They left the hospital carrying the body of their dead child, their lives shattered by a loss that should never have occurred, that had been deliberately inflicted by someone they had trusted completely. Claire Peck would be Beverly Alit's final murder victim, but not because the nurse had suddenly developed a conscience or decided to stop killing. Rather, Claire's death finally triggered the comprehensive investigation that should have been launched weeks earlier. The hospital administration, facing an undeniable pattern of deaths and near-deaths that defied any innocent explanation, finally took decisive action. Ward 4 was effectively shut down. New patients were diverted to other facilities, and a thorough review of all recent cases was initiated. The investigation focused quickly on Beverly Alit. The statistical correlation between her shifts and patient crises was overwhelming, far beyond the possibility of coincidence. Toxicology reports from previous victims were re-examined, revealing the elevated insulin levels and other pharmaceutical evidence that had been noted but not properly investigated earlier. The cumulative evidence painted an unmistakable picture. A nurse had been systematically attacking the children in her care, using her medical knowledge and access to medications to induce life-threatening crises for her own twisted psychological gratification. 15-month-old Michael Davidson was one of the last children to be admitted to Ward 4 before the investigation shut down new admissions. He had been brought in for routine care, but his stay coincided with the period when suspicions about Beverly were intensifying. Michael suffered 2 unexplained collapses during his hospitalization, both occurring when Beverly was on duty, both following the pattern that had become all too familiar to the medical staff. The collapses left him with permanent brain damage, another victim of Beverly's compulsion to create medical emergencies, to control life and death, to be the center of attention and drama. The evidence against Beverly was mounting rapidly, transforming from statistical suspicion to concrete proof. Duty rosters, patient records, toxicology reports, and witness statements all pointed inexorably to the same conclusion. Beverly Alit had been murdering and maiming children under the guise of providing nursing care. The hospital administration, finally acknowledging the full scope of the horror that had unfolded on their watch, suspended Beverly and contacted the police. On May 15, 1991, Beverly Alit was arrested at her home in Grantham. Detectives from Lincolnshire Police arrived early in the morning, their warrant listing multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Beverly initially maintained her innocence, expressing shock and hurt that anyone could suspect her of harming children, the very patients she had worked so hard to save. But her protests rang hollow against the mountain of evidence that was accumulating. During the investigation that followed, police discovered that Beverly's psychological disturbance ran even deeper than her attacks on patients. Her personal history revealed a woman obsessed with illness and injury, someone who had repeatedly fabricated or induced medical problems in herself to gain attention and sympathy. She had undergone unnecessary surgeries, complained of symptoms that couldn't be objectively verified, and spent an inordinate amount of time seeking medical treatment for conditions that either didn't exist or which she had deliberately caused. This pattern had a clinical name, Munchausen syndrome, a psychiatric disorder characterized by the persistent fabrication or induction of physical or psychological symptoms to assume the sick role and receive medical attention. But Beverly had taken her pathology one step further, progressing from making herself sick to making others, specifically vulnerable children, sick. This escalation transformed her diagnosis to Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a particularly malevolent disorder where the perpetrator seeks attention and sympathy by creating or exaggerating illness in someone under their care. The psychiatric evaluations conducted during the investigation revealed a woman driven by an insatiable need for attention, for drama, for the feeling of power that came from controlling whether someone lived or died. She craved the gratitude of parents, the admiration of colleagues, the adrenaline rush of emergency responses. Each attack fed her psychological needs while simultaneously creating the crises that would bring her the attention she desperately sought. The children she attacked were never real people to her, never individuals with hopes and futures and families who loved them. They were props in her psychological theater, tools she used to generate the drama and attention her disordered mind required. The forensic investigation of Ward 4 revealed additional chilling details. Analysis of the drug cabinet logs showed numerous discrepancies, medications that had been accessed but not properly documented, dosages that didn't match prescriptions. Beverly had been stealing insulin, lignocaine, potassium chloride, and other pharmaceutical tools of murder, using them to attack children while maintaining the appearance of a dedicated, caring nurse. Interviews with surviving victims' families revealed patterns they had noticed but dismissed at the time. Beverly's excessive involvement in their children's care, her peculiar insistence on being present during treatments and procedures, her emotional volatility when other nurses were assigned to her patients. One mother recalled how Beverly had become visibly upset when another nurse volunteered to watch her child, how she had insisted on maintaining primary caregiver status even when it wasn't her assigned patient. These behavioral red flags, so obvious in hindsight, had been overlooked or rationalized away during the killing spree, interpreted as dedication rather than possessiveness, as caring rather than control. The investigation also examined why the hospital had been so slow to recognize and respond to the pattern of deaths and near-deaths on Ward 4. The findings were damning. Understaffing had meant that nurses worked in near isolation during night shifts. Minimal supervision had allowed Beverly to access medications without adequate oversight, and the hierarchical culture of the National Health Service had discouraged junior staff from voicing concerns about a colleague's behavior. Additionally, cognitive biases had worked in Beverly's favor. The human tendency to trust caregivers, to assume good intentions, to interpret ambiguous behavior charitably rather than suspiciously. The hospital's slow response had cost lives. Had they acted more decisively after the first unexplained deaths? Had they immediately launched a comprehensive investigation rather than dismissing concerns as statistical anomaly, children who died might have survived, children who were permanently damaged might have been spared. The institutional failures were as catastrophic as Beverly's individual crimes. A systemic breakdown that enabled a serial killer to operate freely in a place dedicated to healing. The trial of Beverly Allitt began on February 15, 1993, at Nottingham Crown Court, nearly 2 years after her arrest. The delay had been necessitated by the complexity of the case. 13 victims, for murders, numerous attempted murders, and mountains of medical and forensic evidence that required extensive analysis and expert testimony. The prosecution faced the challenge of explaining to a jury how a trusted healthcare professional could systematically murder and maim children, of making comprehensible the incomprehensible pathology that drove Beverly's crimes. The courtroom proceedings were grueling for the victims' families, who had to relive their children's suffering in excruciating detail. Parents testified about watching their children collapse without explanation, about trusting the nurse who was actually attacking them, about the permanent disabilities their surviving children now faced. The testimony of Henry Chan's parents was particularly heart-wrenching, as they described through an interpreter their trust in the British healthcare system, their belief that their son was receiving excellent care, and their devastation upon learning that he had been murdered by the nurse they had thanked for trying to save him. The medical testimony was equally disturbing, as doctors and forensic experts walked the jury through the evidence of deliberate poisoning. Toxicology reports showed insulin levels in victims that could only have been externally administered, lignocaine concentrations consistent with injections rather than natural production, and patterns of medication in children's systems that had no therapeutic explanation. The experts explained how Beverly had used her medical knowledge to select substances that would induce catastrophic reactions while being difficult to immediately detect, how she had exploited her access to the drug cabinet and her position of trust to commit her crimes undetected for months. Psychiatric experts testified about Munchausen syndrome by proxy, explaining to the jury how someone could appear caring and dedicated while simultaneously inflicting harm on those in their care. They described the pathological need for attention that drove such behavior, the way perpetrators create medical crises to generate drama and place themselves at the center of life and death situations. The experts noted that Beverly fit the classic profile: a history of fabricated illness in herself, an excessive need for attention and sympathy, a pattern of escalating behavior from self-harm to harm of others, and complete emotional detachment from the suffering she inflicted. Beverly herself did not testify in her own defense, a decision likely made because any attempt to explain or justify her actions would have been damaging beyond repair. Instead, her defense team attempted to raise reasonable doubt about the medical evidence, suggesting that the children's deaths and complications might have resulted from natural causes rather than deliberate poisoning. But the statistical improbability of so many catastrophic events occurring exclusively during one nurse's shifts, combined with the toxicology evidence and the pattern of behavior, made the defense's arguments unconvincing. The trial lasted 8 weeks, during which time the prosecution methodically presented evidence for each of the 13 victims. The jury heard about Liam Taylor, the 7-week-old whose murder had started Beverly's killing spree. They learned about Timothy Hardwick, the 11-year-old with epilepsy who had been stable before Beverly injected him with a lethal dose of lignocaine. They wept over the testimony regarding Kaylee Desmond, Paul Crampton, and Bradley Gibson, all infants who had survived but carried permanent brain damage from Beverly's attacks. They were horrified by the details of Henry Chan's murder, just 2 years old when Beverly decided his life was less important than her need for attention. They listened to the Phillips family describe the nightmare of having both their daughters attacked, Becky and Katie permanently disabled by a nurse who had gained their complete trust. And finally, they heard about Claire Peck, 15 months old, Beverly's final murder victim, a beautiful toddler who should have gone home to her family, but instead died because a nurse needed to create one more crisis, generate one more emergency, be the center of attention one more time. On May 28, 1993, after careful deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts. Beverly Allitt was convicted of 4 counts of murder, Liam Taylor, Timothy Hardwick, Henry Chan, and Claire Peck, 3 counts of attempted murder, Kaylee Desmond, Paul Crampton, and Bradley Gibson, and 6 counts of causing grievous bodily harm, Becky Phillips, Katie Phillips, Michael Davidson, and 3 others. The judge, Mr. Justice Latham, sentenced her to 13 concurrent terms of life imprisonment with a minimum term of 30 years before parole eligibility, one of the longest minimum terms ever imposed at that time. In his sentencing remarks, Justice Latham spoke with barely contained anger about the magnitude of Beverly's crimes. "You have shown yourself capable of acts of the utmost evil. You have repeatedly violated the most sacred trust placed in a medical professional. You have transformed places of healing into chambers of horror. The suffering you inflicted extends far beyond your direct victims to encompass families destroyed, trust shattered, and innocence stolen. The children you attacked were the most vulnerable members of our society, placed in your care by parents who believed you would protect them. Instead, you saw them as nothing more than tools to satisfy your pathological need for attention." The judge continued, "The psychiatric evidence suggests you suffer from a personality disorder that drives you to create medical crises. But whatever the explanation for your behavior, nothing can diminish your moral culpability for these crimes. You had numerous opportunities to stop, to seek help, to choose a different path. Instead, you continued attacking children even as suspicions grew, even as the evidence mounted, driven by compulsions you apparently could not or would not control. The damage you have inflicted is permanent and irreparable." Beverly showed no emotion as the sentences were handed down, her face remaining blank as the judge enumerated her crimes and the suffering she had caused. Victims' families wept in the public gallery, experiencing a mixture of relief that justice had been served and ongoing grief for what they had lost. No sentence, no matter how severe, could restore their children to health, could undo the brain damage and disabilities that would affect them for the rest of their lives, could bring back the 4 children who had been murdered. Following her conviction, Beverly Alit was transferred to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in Nottinghamshire, rather than a standard prison. The placement reflected the court's acknowledgement that her crimes stemmed from severe psychological disturbance, though it in no way diminished her criminal responsibility. At Rampton, she would be housed alongside some of Britain's most dangerous mentally disordered offenders, receiving treatment for her personality disorders while serving her life sentence. But even in custody, Beverly's psychological pathology continued to manifest. She gained significant weight, reportedly reaching over 300 pounds, a behavior some psychiatrists interpreted as an extension of her Munchausen syndrome, creating physical problems that would require medical attention and generate sympathy. She complained constantly of various ailments, some real and some fabricated, maintaining the same pattern of attention-seeking through illness that had characterized her pre-arrest behavior. The staff at Rampton became expert at distinguishing between genuine medical issues and manipulative behavior, a necessary skill when managing someone whose entire identity was wrapped up in playing the victim. The aftermath of the Beverly Alit case reverberated throughout the British healthcare system, prompting urgent reviews of hospital procedures, supervision protocols, and safeguarding measures designed to prevent similar tragedies. The Department of Health commissioned the Clothier Report, a comprehensive investigation into how a nurse had been able to murder and maim children for months without detection. The report, published in 1994, made devastating findings about the systemic failures that had enabled Beverly's crimes. The Clothier Report identified multiple breakdowns in hospital procedures and oversight. The drug cabinet protocols were inadequate, allowing nurses unsupervised access to controlled substances without proper documentation or verification. Staffing levels were dangerously low, particularly during night shifts, creating situations where a single nurse could be alone with vulnerable patients for extended periods without supervision or observation. The hierarchical culture of the NHS discouraged junior staff from questioning the actions of colleagues, even when those actions appeared suspicious. And most damningly, the hospital administration had been slow to recognize and respond to the obvious pattern of unexplained deaths and complications occurring exclusively during one nurse's shifts. The report made numerous recommendations for reform. Enhanced drug cabinet security with double-checking requirements for controlled substances, improved staffing ratios to ensure no nurse ever worked in complete isolation, mandatory incident reporting systems that would flag unusual patterns of patient complications, and cultural changes to encourage staff to voice concerns about colleagues' behavior without fear of retribution. Additionally, the report recommended enhanced pre-employment screening for healthcare workers, including more thorough examination of candidates' medical histories to identify patterns of excessive illness or attention-seeking behavior that might indicate Munchausen syndrome or related disorders. Many of these recommendations were implemented across the NHS, transforming hospital procedures and creating additional safeguards designed to prevent another Beverly Alit. The case became a fixture in medical ethics curricula, studied by nursing and medical students as an example of how psychological pathology can manifest in healthcare settings and how institutional failures can enable individual criminality. Security protocols were enhanced, supervision requirements were strengthened, and the medical profession gained a painful awareness that the trust placed in healthcare workers could occasionally be catastrophically misplaced. The families of Beverly's victims struggled to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of the trial. The parents of murdered children, Liam Taylor, Timothy Hardwick, Henry Chon, and Claire Peck, faced the impossible task of moving forward after losing a child to deliberate murder. Their grief was compounded by guilt, the irrational but overwhelming feeling that they should have known something was wrong, should have protected their children from the nurse they had trusted. Support groups were established to help families cope with the unique trauma of having a child harmed by a medical professional, of having their trust in the healthcare system so profoundly violated. The families of surviving victims faced different but equally challenging struggles. Children like Kaylee Desmond, Paul Crampton, Bradley Gibson, Becky and Katie Phillips, and Michael Davidson had survived Beverly's attacks but carried permanent disabilities. Brain damage from oxygen deprivation, developmental delays, physical impairments that would require lifelong care and accommodation. Their parents became full-time caregivers, managing therapies and medical appointments, fighting for educational resources and disability benefits, watching their children struggle with tasks that should have been simple but which their damaged brains could no longer easily perform. Some victims filed civil lawsuits against Grantham Hospital and the NHS, seeking compensation for the negligence that had allowed Beverly to continue attacking children even after clear patterns had emerged. The settlements varied, but no amount of money could truly compensate for what had been stolen. Childhoods destroyed, potential unrealized, futures permanently altered by a nurse's psychological compulsions. The financial compensation provided resources for ongoing care and therapy, but it couldn't restore lost brain function or erase the trauma of what had been endured. The psychological impact on Ward 4 staff was profound and lasting. Nurses who had worked alongside Beverly experienced guilt, anger, and betrayal. They questioned how they had missed the signs, how someone they had considered a colleague and friend could have been systematically murdering children. Some left the nursing profession entirely, unable to reconcile their calling to heal with the knowledge that one of their own had perverted that calling so completely. Others doubled their vigilance, becoming hyper-aware of colleagues' behavior, sometimes to the point of paranoia, their trust in fellow healthcare workers permanently damaged. The broader nursing community grappled with the reputational damage caused by Beverly's crimes. Patient trust in nurses, long considered one of the most trusted professions, was shaken. Parents became more anxious about hospitalized children, more watchful of nursing staff, more likely to question medical decisions and procedures. The nursing profession worked hard to rebuild that trust, emphasizing the rarity of cases like Beverly Elitz and the enhanced safeguards now in place. But the shadow of her crimes lingered for years. Beverly's case also sparked broader discussions about Munchausen syndrome by proxy and how to identify and prevent it. The medical community recognized that while rare, the disorder represented a genuine threat in healthcare settings, where individuals with the condition had both motive and opportunity to harm vulnerable patients. Researchers studied the characteristics of perpetrators, identifying warning signs, excessive volunteering for shifts, emotional possessiveness over certain patients, patterns of being present during all medical emergencies, and histories of fabricated or induced illness in themselves. Hospitals implemented screening procedures designed to identify staff members who might pose similar risks, though the challenge remained balancing necessary vigilance with avoiding unfair suspicion of dedicated professionals. The question of whether Beverly Elitz should ever be released from custody has been periodically debated. Her minimum term of 30 years means she became eligible for parole consideration in 2022. Though any release would require the parole board to be satisfied, she no longer poses a danger to the public. Given the nature of her crimes, the psychological pathology that drove them, and her continued attention-seeking behavior even in custody, most observers consider it highly unlikely she will ever be released. The risk of reoffending, particularly given that her crimes were driven by deep-seated personality disorders rather than situational factors, is considered too high to justify returning her to society. Victims' families have been vocal in their opposition to any possibility of Beverly's release. They have submitted impact statements to the parole board, describing the ongoing effects of her crimes and their fear that she might harm other children if given the opportunity. The parents of Claire Peck have been particularly active in campaigning against her release, arguing that someone who murdered a 15-month-old child for attention should never again be free. Their advocacy has ensured that Beverly's crimes remain in the public consciousness, that the horror of what she did is not forgotten or minimized by the passage of time. The legacy of Beverly Elitz's crimes extends beyond the immediate victims and their families to encompass broader changes in how healthcare systems approach safeguarding, how the medical profession identifies and responds to concerning patterns, and how society understands the potential for evil to hide behind a caring facade. Her case demonstrated that monsters don't always announce themselves, don't always look dangerous or act suspiciously. Sometimes they smile warmly, speak gently, and wear the uniforms of those we trust most completely. Ward 4 at Grantham Hospital was eventually closed permanently, the physical space too contaminated by the horrors that had occurred there to ever again serve as a place of healing. The building stood empty for years, a monument to institutional failure and individual evil, before finally being repurposed for administrative functions far removed from patient care. Staff who had worked there during Beverly's killing spree scattered to other hospitals, other wards, carrying with them the trauma of what they had witnessed and the guilt of what they had failed to prevent. The children's graves. Liam Taylor, Timothy Hardwick, Henry Chan, and Claire Peck receive regular visits from families who continue to mourn, who place flowers and toys on small headstones marking lives cut tragically short. The inscriptions speak of beloved children, of grief that never fully heals, of parents' undying love for sons and daughters stolen by someone who should have protected them. These graves serve as reminders that behind the statistics and sensational headlines were real people, individual children with personalities and preferences, with families who loved them and futures that were never realized. The surviving victims, now adults or approaching adulthood, continue to live with the consequences of Beverly's attacks. Some have spoken publicly about their experiences, about growing up with disabilities that they didn't cause and didn't deserve, about knowing that someone deliberately damaged their brains when they were too young to defend themselves. Their courage in speaking out has helped maintain awareness of Beverly's crimes and has provided inspiration to others dealing with the aftermath of violent crime. They refuse to be defined solely as victims, working to build meaningful lives despite the challenges imposed on them by a nurse's psychological pathology. The question that haunts everyone connected to this case is perhaps the most fundamental. Why? Why did Beverly Allitt murder and maim helpless children? The psychiatric explanations, Munchausen syndrome by proxy, personality disorders, pathological need for attention, provide clinical frameworks but don't fully capture the horror of a human being who could smile at a child while planning to inject that child with poison. The theories about her psychological development, about childhood experiences that might have contributed to her disordered personality, offer context but not excuse. Ultimately, Beverly Allitt made choices, repeated choices over months to attack vulnerable children for her own gratification, and no diagnosis can absolve her of responsibility for those choices. Some criminologists have compared Beverly to other angels of death, healthcare workers who kill patients under their care, often driven by similar psychological needs for attention, power, and control. Cases like Dr. Harold Shipman, who murdered hundreds of patients, or Janine Jones, a Texas nurse who killed infants through insulin and other drug injections, share disturbing similarities with Beverly's crimes. These comparisons reveal that while rare, the phenomenon of healthcare serial killers represents a genuine category of criminal behavior, one that exploits the unique vulnerabilities of the patient-caregiver relationship and the trust inherent in medical settings. The Beverly Allitt case forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the institutions and professionals we trust most completely can sometimes harbor the greatest dangers. The case challenged the assumption that caring professions attract only caring individuals, that someone who chooses to become a nurse must inherently value life and health. Beverly demonstrated that psychological pathology can hide behind any facade, that evil can wear scrubs and carry a stethoscope, that the most dangerous predators are sometimes those we invite into our most vulnerable moments. The media coverage of Beverly's trial and conviction was intense and sustained, with British newspapers featuring daily reports of the proceedings and television programs analyzing every aspect of the case. The tabloid press dubbed her the Angel of Death, a grimly ironic title that captured the perversion of her role as caregiver transformed into killer. Some coverage focused excessively on her appearance and weight gain, veering into sensationalism that detracted from serious examination of how such crimes could be prevented in future. But other reporting performed valuable public service, examining the systemic failures and advocating for the reforms that would eventually be implemented. Documentaries and true crime programs have revisited Beverly's case repeatedly in the decades since her conviction, each new generation discovering with horror the story of the nurse who murdered children in her care. These retellings serve multiple purposes: maintaining public awareness of the crimes, ensuring victims are not forgotten, educating new healthcare professionals about the warning signs of similar behavior, and satisfying the public's complicated fascination with true crime narratives. The case has become a fixture in criminal psychology curricula, studied alongside other serial killers and healthcare murderers as an example of how psychological disorders can manifest in catastrophic criminal behavior. The security classification of Beverly's imprisonment at Rampton reflects an ongoing assessment that she remains dangerous, that the psychological drivers of her crimes persist despite decades of treatment and medication, Reports from the facility indicate she continues to exhibit attention-seeking behavior, to manipulate staff when possible, and to show little genuine insight into the suffering she inflicted. The psychiatric consensus appears to be that while she intellectually understands her crimes were wrong and harmful, she lacks the emotional capacity for genuine remorse or empathy for her victims. In recent years, some of Beverly's surviving victims have advocated for changes to the UK's life sentence procedures, arguing that someone who deliberately murdered or permanently disabled children should never be considered for parole regardless of time served or psychiatric treatment. These campaigns have sparked broader debates about the purpose of imprisonment, whether it should focus primarily on punishment, rehabilitation, or public protection, and whether certain crimes are so heinous that perpetrators forfeit any right to eventual freedom. The hospital where Beverly committed her crimes underwent multiple restructurings in the aftermath, with administrators replaced, procedures overhauled, and a comprehensive cultural transformation implemented to prevent any recurrence of the institutional failures that had enabled her killing spree. Grantham and Kesteven Hospital remains operational today, providing essential healthcare services to the local community, but it carries the permanent shadow of the horrors that unfolded on Ward 4 during those terrible months in 1991. The final word on Beverly Alit belongs not to psychiatrists analyzing her pathology, not to criminologists studying her methods, not to journalists chronicling her crimes, but to the families whose lives she destroyed. In their victim impact statements, in their continued advocacy, in their refusal to let their children be forgotten, they speak truth about the cost of evil. The empty chairs at family dinners, the milestones never celebrated, the future stolen by someone who saw their children as nothing more than props in her psychological theater. Liam Taylor would have been in his 30s now, perhaps with children of his own. Timothy Hardwick might have pursued his love of football, maybe playing professionally or coaching youth teams. Henry Chan would have grown up in the loving immigrant family that worked so hard to provide him opportunities. Claire Peck would have experienced all the joys and challenges of growing into adulthood, forming relationships, discovering her passions, building a life. Instead, they exist only in photographs that never age, in memories that their parents cling to, in the terrible knowledge that they died not from illness or accident but from deliberate murder by someone sworn to protect them. The surviving victims carry forward with courage and resilience, refusing to be defined solely by what was done to them, building lives and identities beyond their status as Beverly Alit's victims. But they also carry permanent reminders, the cognitive challenges, the physical limitations, the knowledge that their brains were damaged when they were infants by someone who should have cared for them. Their families carry different scars, the guilt, the hypervigilance, the permanent disruption of their lives, the financial and emotional costs of providing lifelong care for children whose disabilities were entirely preventable. Beverly Alit transformed a children's ward into a killing field, murdered 4 innocent children, and permanently disabled at least 9 others over the course of 59 days in the spring of 1991. Her crimes revealed systemic failures in healthcare oversight, demonstrated the potential for psychological pathology to manifest in catastrophically harmful ways, and forced society to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can hide behind any facade, even that of a smiling nurse in a children's ward. She remains imprisoned at Rampton Secure Hospital, where she will likely spend the remainder of her life, her name synonymous with the betrayal of trust, the perversion of the caring professions, and the terrible vulnerability of those we place in others' care. The children she killed are remembered not primarily as her victims, but as individuals whose lives mattered, whose losses diminished the world, and whose deaths demand that we remain forever vigilant against those who would harm the most vulnerable among us. The story of Beverly Alit is not ultimately about her. It is about the children she killed and harmed, the families she destroyed, the trust she violated, and the reforms her crimes necessitated. It is a reminder that evil exists, that vigilance is necessary, that trust must be balanced with appropriate oversight, and that the cost of institutional failure is measured in children's graves and shattered lives. The monster wore a nurse's uniform, carried medicine that became murder, and smiled while children died. We remember not to glorify her crimes, but to honor her victims and to ensure that the systemic failures that enabled her killing spree are never repeated. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.